Bedtime Reading. A Christmas Carol. Chapter 1. The Ghost of Jacob Marley. Good reader, to begin our story, you must understand that Jacob Marley was dead. There is no doubt at all about this fact. At Marley's funeral, all the important papers, which said that Marley was dead, were signed by the churchmen and the only other person at the funeral. There was no family at this funeral, for old Marley had no family, and he only had one friend. That friend was Ebenezer Scrooge. Scrooge signed the funeral papers, and Scrooge's name was very well known and respected in the city. So if Scrooge said that Marley was dead, then Marley was dead. Truthfully, old Marley was as dead as the nail in a door. Now listen, I don't want to say that I know or that I can imagine what a dead doornail is like. Doornails are not alive, of course. Perhaps the nails in a coffin, which hold the lid down, are deader than a doornail would be. But the expression, dead as a doornail, comes from our old ancestors, who were very wise, of course. My simple mind should not challenge the wisdom of our ancestors. Otherwise, terrible things would surely happen to the country of England. So, good reader, you will allow me to say once again that Jacob Marley was as dead as a doornail. Of course, Scrooge knew that Marley was dead. How could Scrooge not know? You see, Scrooge and Marley were partners for many, many years. Scrooge was a lawyer, and he was Marley's only friend and the only person at the funeral besides the churchmen. Do not think that Scrooge was sad that Marley had died. On the day of the funeral, Scrooge was a man of business, and signed the papers quickly, the way a lawyer should. Talking about Marley's funeral reminds me of the beginning of our story. There is no doubt that old Marley was dead. I know that I have said this many times, and the reader is thinking, when will he stop repeating himself? But this fact has to be understood first, or the reader will not appreciate the rest of this amazing story. So, Marley was dead, but Scrooge was still alive. Scrooge did not remove Marley's name from the sign outside their office door. For many years after this, the sign said Scrooge and Marley, lawyers, even though there was no Marley. Sometimes customers who had just come to London called Scrooge Marley, and sometimes they called him Scrooge. Scrooge answered to both names. He did not care. Scrooge did not care about anything at all. The other important thing that the reader must understand at the beginning of our story is that Ebenezer Scrooge was a horrible person. He was a cruel, angry, unhappy, greedy, bitter, clever, sour old man. He was like a hard knife with a sharp edge that cut people until they bled. There was no warmth in his body, in his mind, or in his heart. He was always alone, and he wanted to be alone. The coldness and anger inside his heart made his body look very strange. Sometimes when people passed the old Scrooge on the street, they thought that he looked as if he had been frozen. They always remembered Ebenezer Scrooge, but they did not like the memory. His long, thin nose was red, his thin lips were blue, and his small eyes were as blue as ice. He walked slowly, and his face always had the same sour, angry expression. He always wore a coat, even if it was a beautiful spring day. His voice was as cold as a bitter wind, and unpleasant to listen to. Scrooge seemed to like the cold. He never warmed his office or his house at all, even in the coldest days of the year or on Christmas. This is because Scrooge did not care whether it was cold or hot outside. No cold winter could make him cold, and no warm summer day could make him warm. This is because nothing was colder and bitterer than old Scrooge himself. The heaviest, coldest rains and snows in London were better than Scrooge, because they were nicer to look at. When Ebenezer Scrooge walked the streets of London, you would never see a person come near him and say, "My good friend Scrooge, it's wonderful to see you. How are you today? And when will you come to visit me?" No beggars asked him for money, and no children asked him what time it was. No one ever asked Scrooge the directions to this or that place. Even the dogs of London wanted to stay away from him. But did Scrooge care? Of course not. This was the sort of treatment he liked. Scrooge wanted to live his life alone. He wanted everyone to stay away from him. The more afraid they were, the better it was. It was Christmas Eve. Instead of sitting at home next to a nice, warm fire, old Scrooge sat working in his office. Outside it was terribly cold, with a heavy fog. Scrooge could hear the people in the streets laughing and talking. It was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon, but it had been dark all day, and people were lighting candles inside their homes. The fog was so thick that it sat in the streets, and people could not see their friends standing next to them. The air seemed like it was filled with ghosts. Inside Scrooge's building, the door to his office was open, so that he could watch his clerk, whose name was Bob Cratchit, and make sure that he was working hard. Bob was sitting in a dark little room and copying letters. Scrooge's office had one small fire, but Bob's room was so much smaller that it could not keep a mouse warm. But Bob could not build a bigger fire, because Scrooge kept all the coal in his office and would not share it. So the clerk had to wear his thin coats and try to warm himself with a candle at his desk. Of course, this was impossible. Suddenly, Scrooge and Bob heard a cheerful voice. "Merry Christmas, Uncle, and God bless you," someone said. It was Scrooge's nephew, who had suddenly run into the building. "Oh, be quiet," said Scrooge. "Christmas is stupid." Scrooge's nephew had walked so quickly through the snow and fog that his cheeks were red and his skin seemed to glow. His face was handsome, and his eyes sparkled happily. "Christmas is stupid," said the nephew. "Surely you're not serious, dear uncle." "I am serious," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right do you have to be merry? What reason do you have to be merry? You're poor. You don't have any money." "Oh, uncle," said the nephew cheerfully, "what right do you have to be angry? What reason do you have to be unhappy? You're rich." Scrooge did not know what to say to this, so he said "Bah!" in an angry way and tried to continue his work. "Don't be angry, uncle," said the nephew. "Why shouldn't I be angry?" Scrooge almost shouted. "When I live in a world of fools. Merry Christmas! I don't have any use for Christmas. It's only a time to pay more bills and find myself a year older and not any wiser and not any richer. I always find that I haven't done enough work, and there are more papers to read and sign. If I was the king of this country, every man who walked around saying Merry Christmas like a fool would be cooked just like a Christmas turkey." "Uncle, that's terrible," cried Scrooge's nephew. "Nephew," said Scrooge firmly, "you celebrate Christmas in your way, and let me celebrate it in my way." "But you don't celebrate it," said the nephew. "Well, "Let me leave Christmas alone, then," said Scrooge. "It's a ridiculous holiday, just like all holidays. I don't know why you think it's so wonderful. You don't make any money during holidays." "I believe that all holidays are good, Uncle. Even though I do not make any money on those days, you are right," said the nephew slowly. "Christmas is a very poor time of the year for me, but I have always thought of Christmas time as a wonderful, happy time of the year. It is a time to be with family and friends and to give to the poor. It is the only time of the year when men and women are happy to open their hearts and be joyful. So, Uncle, even though I do not make any money on Christmas, I believe that it is wonderful. So I say, God bless Christmas." Bob Cratchit, the clerk, began to clap and cheer at the nephew's speech. But then he realized that Scrooge would be angry with him, so he quickly turned around and tried to work. "You, Bob Cratchit, if I hear another sound from you, you'll celebrate your Christmas by losing your job," Scrooge shouted. Then he looked at his nephew. "You're a very powerful speaker. I'm surprised you aren't interested in politics." "Don't be angry with me, dear uncle. Come and eat dinner with us tomorrow." "Nephew," said Scrooge, his face turning red, "I'd rather eat dinner with you in hell first." "But why?" cried the nephew. "Are you angry with me for getting married?" "Why did you get married, nephew?" asked Scrooge. "Because I fell in love, of course," said the nephew. "Because you fell in love?" shouted Scrooge, as if this was the most ridiculous thing in the world, besides Christmas. "Goodbye." "Uncle, you never told me you didn't agree with my marriage. Why don't you come and dine with my wife and I?" "Good afternoon. Goodbye," said Scrooge. "I don't want anything from you. I am not asking you to do anything for me. Why can't we be friends?" "Go away," said Scrooge. "Uncle, I am sorry with all my heart to see you so angry. We have never had any quarrel before. I hope I haven't done something to offend you. But I really believe in the spirit of Christmas, so I will say it again. Merry Christmas, Uncle, and God bless you, and a Happy New Year, too." "Leave my office this minute," shouted Scrooge. His nephew left him. He wasn't angry with his uncle. He knew what kind of man Scrooge was, but he was always nice to him anyway. The nephew told Bob Cratchit, the clerk, that he hoped he would have a good Christmas. Of course, this clerk was a much nicer man than Scrooge, because he said, "Merry Christmas to you too, sir," very softly so that Scrooge couldn't hear. But Scrooge did hear. "There's another man," thought Scrooge, "who is a stupid fool, just like my nephew. He only makes 15 shillings a week for money, and he has a wife and family, and he talks about a Merry Christmas. I'm going to leave the country." Unfortunately, it seemed that Scrooge was not going to have a peaceful afternoon. Immediately after his nephew left, the door opened and 2 other men walked in. They were well-dressed men, and they took their hats off and stood in Scrooge's office. They had many books and papers in their hands, and they bowed to Scrooge. "This office is Scrooge and Marley's, isn't it?" said one of the gentlemen, looking at a paper. "And are you Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley, good sir?" "Mr. Marley has been dead for 7 years," said Scrooge. "He died 7 years ago on this very night." "Well, I am sure that you will be able to help us, Mr. Scrooge," said the other gentleman. When the man said the word help, Scrooge looked angry, because he did not like to help people. "Who are you?" he asked the gentleman. "At this happy time of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said one of the men, "it is very important to help the poor and needy people of our city. Many thousands of people need basic things like food, clothing, and shelter. During Christmas, these poor people may also enjoy a few special things, such as small toys for their children. Some of us are trying to raise money to help these people. Would you give some money to help the poor at Christmas?" Here were more people bothering him about Christmas. "Gentlemen, I want to be left alone," said Scrooge. "I don't celebrate Christmas, so I won't help other people celebrate Christmas. If they're poor and lazy, then that is their own fault." "But, sir, many people die in the cold at this time of year," said one of the men angrily. "Well, the population of this country is too big. A few deaths won't hurt," said Scrooge. These two gentlemen thought that they had never met anyone as horrible as old Scrooge, but they said nothing. Instead, they turned around and left the building without another word. Scrooge returned to his work. He was very pleased with himself for having made the troublesome gentleman leave. Outside, it became darker and colder. Men with carriages and horses ran around in the streets, offering to take people to their homes. People could barely see in the fog. Near Scrooge's building there was an old church with a large clock on its tower. This clock could not be seen because of the fog, but the hours passed quickly. In the small, dark streets, some people had built a large fire and were standing around it, their faces red from the heat. Poor men and boys in thin clothes were warming their hands and bodies near the fire and eating the hot-baked nuts that were sold in the streets. Sometimes this was the only food they had all day. The food shops were warm and bright and filled with people buying foods for the Christmas dinner the next day. In his large, beautiful house, the mayor of London was ordering his 50 cooks to make an enormous Christmas dinner for his many guests. In houses all over London, men were making Christmas sweets while their wives went out to buy the beef. A group of young boys knocked at Scrooge's door. They were singing Christmas songs to people in exchange for a little money. When Scrooge opened the door, the boys immediately began to sing a Christmas song. But Scrooge looked so mean and horrible standing there that the boys immediately ran away. "I'd rather sing for the devil," said one boy. When it was time for Scrooge to go home, he locked his office door and went into the room where Bob Cratchit was working. He was feeling especially mean and angry because people had been bothering him about Christmas. He hated Christmas and everything about it. "Well, Cratchit, you'll probably want to stay home tomorrow, won't you?" said Scrooge. "Yes, sir, if it's convenient for you," said Bob Cratchit. "Well, it isn't convenient for me, and it's not fair. Why should I give you a day's salary if you're not working?" Scrooge said angrily. The clerk did not know what to say. "It's only once a year, sir," he said. "So what? I don't care. That's no reason for robbing me of my money every December 25th, said Scrooge, putting on his coat. "All right, you can stay home tomorrow, but be here early the next morning." Bob Cratchit promised that he would, and Scrooge left without another word. The office of Scrooge and Marley was closed, and the clerk and Scrooge went in different directions. Bob Cratchit stopped to say hello to the boys on the street, because it was Christmas. Then he ran home, thinking happily of his wife and children and the next day. At least he would get to spend Christmas with his family. Scrooge went and had dinner at his usual restaurant and read the newspapers while he ate. He did not speak to anyone, of course, and no one spoke to him. After dinner he sat at the table reading his papers and books for a while, and then walked home. Scrooge lived in a building that had once belonged to old Jacob Marley. It was a very dark and frightening old building, and most of the rooms inside were offices. But there were a few rooms that Scrooge lived in. It was so dark and foggy outside that Scrooge had to walk very slowly, with his hands in front of him so that he would not bump into something and fall down. Finally, he saw the building where he lived. It had a tall black gate around it, and its door was tall and red, and it had an extremely large round doorknob in its center. Now, there was nothing at all strange about the doorknob on this door, except that it was larger than many others. Scrooge saw it every day, and he never paid attention to it. After all doors had doorknobs. It is also true that Scrooge did not have an imagination. Even when he was a little boy, he had not had one. The reader must also understand that since Scrooge had spoken to the visiting gentleman earlier that day, he had not thought about Marley once. Truthfully, in the past 7 years, Scrooge had not thought about Marley at all. So, dear reader, it was extremely strange that when Scrooge went to open the door to his house, he saw that the doorknob had changed into Marley's face. Marley's face. The pale, cold moon appeared from behind the clouds and shone on the doorknob, and Scrooge saw very clearly the face of old dead Marley where the doorknob used to be. The face was not angry or fierce-looking. Its eyes, nose, and mouth were Marley's. Scrooge noticed the eyes most. Marley's wide eyes were staring at Scrooge, and they did not move or blink. There was a look of fear in them. As Scrooge stared at this strange vision, it became a doorknob again. The face was gone. Now, it would be untrue to say that Scrooge was not surprised, or that he was not aware of a strange, terrible feeling in his heart. Other men would call this feeling fear. But Scrooge had never been afraid of anything before, so he entered the house as usual. He lit a candle to see with. He did stop for a moment and look at the doorknob again cautiously, as if he expected to see the terrible face of his old partner staring at him. But there was nothing there. "Bother!" Scrooge said, and closed the door loudly. The loud sound echoed through the cold, dark rooms of the building, but Scrooge was not the sort of person who is afraid of the dark. He took his small candle and walked up the stairs to his rooms. It was so dark that many lamps wouldn't have lit the house, so Scrooge's little candle did not do any good. Scrooge didn't care. He preferred the dark, but before he went to bed he walked through his rooms, making sure that everything was all right. He had not quite forgotten the face in the door. Everything in the rooms was normal. There was no one hiding under the table or the bed. There was a small fire in the fireplace, and a little bowl of medicine next to the bed, because Scrooge had a cold. In the bedroom, the sitting room, and the room where the firewood was kept, everything was quiet and ordinary looking. Scrooge's sleeping clothes were hung up in the closet, and his slippers were by the bed. Very satisfied, Scrooge shut the door that separated his rooms from the rest of the building, but he locked himself in, which was not his custom. Then he went into the sitting room and sat down by the fire. It was an extremely small fire, and it was useless on such a cold night. Scrooge had to lean over it before he began to feel any warmth. The light from the fire made shadows on the walls of the dark room. As Scrooge sat there, he could not help but remember Marley's strange and terrible face looking at him from the door. It seemed to Scrooge that the face kept appearing in the shadows. "Bah!" said Scrooge, and walked around the room a few times. When he sat down again, Scrooge happened to look at a bell that hung on the wall. It was an old bell that had not been used for some time. As Scrooge stared at the bell, he was horrified to see it begin to move by itself, swinging back and forth slowly. At first the bell rang softly, But the sound grew louder and louder until it seemed to Scrooge that the whole house was filled with the sound of bells. Scrooge did not know how long the terrible bells rang, because he had run to his bed and put pillows over his ears. But after a while, the sound of the bells grew softer and softer until it was gone. "What is going on in here?" said Scrooge angrily, but his body was shaking and his face was pale. But the strange sounds weren't over yet. After the bells had stopped ringing, Scrooge heard an even louder sound that came from down below on the first floor. It seemed as though someone was dragging many long, heavy metal chains around the floor. Scrooge had heard that ghosts often wore heavy chains. The sound of the chains grew louder and louder. The person was walking up the stairs. "Ridiculous," said Scrooge. "This isn't happening." His face grew even paler, though, when the person passed through Scrooge's door without opening it and walked loudly into the room. "I know him! It's Marley's ghost," Scrooge thought, but he was too shocked to say anything. He could see through the ghost's body, but Scrooge was sure that it was Marley's ghost. The ghost's clothes and hair were the same as Marley's were 7 years earlier. The ghost wore a heavy chain wrapped around his body. The chain was covered with many locks and heavy metal boxes. The room had become as cold as ice, and the ghost was standing there in front of him. His eyes saw it clearly. Scrooge observed everything about this ghost, but still he did not believe what he was seeing. He decided to speak to the ghost to see if it would answer. "Well, well, I don't like evening visitors when I'm trying to go to bed," said Scrooge, as loud and angry as always. "What do you want? I didn't invite you here." "Many things," said the ghost. It was Marley's voice. "Who are you?" said Scrooge. "Who am I? Ask me who I was when I was a living man," said the ghost. "Oh, all right. You're very particular for a ghost," said Scrooge. "Who were you when you were alive?" "In life, I was Jacob Marley, your partner," said the ghost. "Well, can you sit down?" asked Scrooge. He was wondering if a ghost could sit down in a chair, and he wanted to see. "I can," said the ghost. "Do it then," said Scrooge. He was trying to act as if everything was normal. The ghost sat down on the edge of a chair, looking at Scrooge all the time. "I don't think you believe in me," said the ghost calmly. "You're right. I don't believe in you," said Scrooge. "Well, can you prove that I am not real?" said the ghost. "Well, no, I can't," said Scrooge angrily. He didn't want to look at the ghost's face. The ghost's face was so horrible, and its large eyes never blinked. The ghost was staring at him, and Scrooge felt colder and colder. "Do you see this toothpick, ghost?" said Scrooge. He wanted to make the ghost look at something besides himself. "I do see it," said the ghost. The ghost was still staring at him. "But you aren't looking at it," said Scrooge. "But I see it anyway. I see everything," said the ghost, and gave a terrible cry. It shook its chains, and the sound was terrible. Scrooge felt as if his blood was turning to ice. He fell to the floor on his knees, putting his hands over his ears. "Man of the living world," said the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "Yes," said Scrooge. "I do. I must believe in you, ghost. But why do ghosts walk the earth? And why do they come to me? Why are you here?" It is required that each man should be good to other men. But if he is not, when he dies, that man's spirit is doomed to walk the earth forever, and see all the happiness that he might have had in life, and cannot ever have again. Oh, pity me, said the ghost, and gave another terrible cry. It shook its loud, heavy chains and waved its hands in the air as if it was very upset. "Why are you wearing those terrible chains, ghost?" asked Scrooge. "After I died, I had to wear the chains that I made for myself in life," said the ghost. "I made these chains little by little. I built them piece by piece, until they were as long, cold, and heavy as they are now. It was my choice to build these chains. Surely they are familiar to you." At first Scrooge did not understand what the ghost meant. But as he looked more closely at the chains, he saw that there were many heavy money boxes hanging on them. They were the same kind of boxes that Scrooge kept his money in. Scrooge trembled. "And would you like to know," said the ghost, "the weight and length of the terrible chain you are building for yourself right now, this very minute? 7 years ago, on the Christmas Eve of my death, your chain was as full and heavy as this. For 7 long years you have continued to build it. Just think how heavy it must be now. It is waiting for you." Very upset and afraid, Scrooge glanced around him, almost expecting to see his body covered with terrible heavy chains like the ghost's. "Jacob, old friend," cried Scrooge, "what is the meaning of this? I don't understand. Do you have anything good to tell me?" "No," said the ghost. "I have only bad news to bring you. And I cannot tell you everything I would like to. I can only stay here for a short time. My curse is that I must walk the world never resting. When I was alive, my mind never left our office. I was always thinking of money and more ways to become rich. Now I must roam the world never stopping." Whenever Scrooge was thinking hard about something, he always put his hands in his pockets. He did this now, and said quietly, "You must travel very slowly, Jacob." "What do you mean?" said the ghost. "Well, you have been dead for 7 years. Have you been traveling all this time?" asked Scrooge. "Yes, no rest, no peace. I live in regret," cried the ghost, and gave another terrible cry. It moved its chain so loudly that Scrooge's ears hurt. "Even though I am sad and sorry now, I cannot have the opportunities I missed when I was alive." "But you are a good man of business, Jacob," said Scrooge. He was thinking of himself as he said this. "A good man of business? Perhaps, but I did not understand what my true purpose on this earth really was. My real business was to help all mankind through good deeds. That was my real business. But all I thought about was money. How selfish I was. I should have paid more attention," cried the ghost. It moved its chains and sighed loudly. "My pain is the worst at this time of year, Christmas time. Like you, I believed that Christmas was ridiculous. I never had a kind word or a thought to give to anyone at this time of year. I did not give to the poor, and I thought only of myself and my money. I did not care about anything at Christmas time or any other time. If I had, I might have been saved." Scrooge saw that tears were falling down the ghost's face. "Now listen to me," said the ghost. "My time here is nearly gone." "I'm listening, Jacob. Please, have pity on me," cried Scrooge. He wondered what terrible thing the ghost was about to tell him. "I have sat next to you for many days and nights, watching you. It is a terrible part of my punishment. You have never been able to see me, but tonight you can. The reason for that I cannot tell you." When he thought of Jacob Marley's terrible ghost watching him all the time, Scrooge felt even more afraid. "I have come here tonight to warn you. You have one chance and hope left of escaping my punishment when you die. I have come to try and help you." "You were always a good friend, Jacob," said Scrooge. "Thank you." "Ebenezer Scrooge," said the ghost, "you are going to be visited by 3 spirits." "3 spirits," said Scrooge. He did not want to see any more ghosts. "Well, I think I'd rather not see any more spirits." "Without their visits," said the ghost, "you will become just like me as I am now. The first spirit will arrive tomorrow morning at 1 o'clock. "Couldn't I just see them all at once? Wouldn't that be faster?" asked Scrooge. "Silence!" cried the ghost in a terrible voice. Scrooge fell on his knees again. "The second spirit will arrive on the second night at the same time, and the third spirit will arrive on the third night at midnight. Now, you will see me no more, and if you want to escape my fate, remember me, Ebenezer Scrooge. Remember what I have said." Then the ghost picked up its chains. He stared at Scrooge for another long minute, and then slowly began to walk towards the window. Scrooge saw the window begin to open by itself. When the ghost reached the window, it turned around and motioned with its hand for Scrooge to follow. When Scrooge was only a few feet away from the ghost, it raised its hand for him to stop. Scrooge was surprised and afraid to hear strange noises in the air, words and cries of pain and regret. Were there other ghosts in the room? Jacob Marley's ghost floated out of the window. When Scrooge went to the window to watch it leave, he saw an amazing sight. Many ghosts floated in the air, and they all wore long, terrible chains. Many of the ghosts had once been people Scrooge knew. They were the ghosts of other lawyers and businessmen. All of them cried out in terrible pain and sadness. Scrooge realized that all the ghosts were unhappy because they had never been good and kind in life. Now that they were dead, they had lost their chance. Scrooge watched the ghosts fade into the mist and fog. The last thing he heard was the voice of Jacob Marley's ghost crying out together with all the others. Scrooge closed the window and made sure that all the doors were locked. He did not know why he did this, because if any ghost wanted to visit him, a locked door or a closed window would not keep it out. Scrooge tried to say, "Bah!" in his loud and angry voice, but he could not speak. He was shaking too much, and his voice was only a whisper. He suddenly felt extremely sleepy and tired. It was late, and he had had a strange, frightening evening. All he wanted to do was sleep and forget the ghost of Jacob Marley. Scrooge undressed, climbed into bed, and fell asleep as soon as his head touched the pillow. Chapter 2. The First Spirit. When Scrooge woke up, it was so dark in the room that he could barely see. He was shocked to see that it was still night-time. "How long have I slept?" he thought. "Perhaps not long. I hope morning will arrive soon." Suddenly he heard the sound of the large clock on the church tower. The clock would tell him what time it was. "Probably it's almost dawn," said Scrooge. However, to his amazement, the bells in the clock rang 5, 6, 7, 8, 12 times. How could it be 12 o'clock at night? Scrooge thought that it must have been 2 o'clock in the morning when he went to bed. "The clock must be broken. It can't be possible that I have slept through one whole day and into the next night." This idea was so upsetting to Scrooge that he jumped out of bed and ran to the window. It was very foggy outside and extremely cold. There were no sounds of people running in the streets. Scrooge was relieved. "Everyone is still sleeping. That stupid clock is probably just broken," he said, and got into his bed again. The room was terribly cold because the little fire had died many hours ago. Scrooge laid in his bed and thought. He was trying to understand what had happened. Had Jacob Marley's ghost really come to see him? Was it all a bad dream? Scrooge tried to tell himself that ghosts were not real, and only stupid children believed in them. But he could not persuade himself that a ghost had not been there. Those terrible chains and the way the ghost had cried out. Scrooge remembered every moment. Suddenly, he sat up in bed, because he remembered that Marley's ghost had told him that the first spirit would arrive at 1 o'clock. He decided to stay awake until the clock had struck 1, just to see what would happen. "I am sure that no spirit will enter my bedroom, and I can go to sleep and forget all about this," said Scrooge. But he was not so sure. The hour between 12 and 1 o'clock passed slowly. Scrooge almost fell asleep once or twice, but suddenly the clock struck 1. "There, nothing happened," said Scrooge loudly. Suddenly there was a bright light in the room. As Scrooge watched, a small white hand pulled back the curtains around his bed. Amazed and frightened, Scrooge sat up in bed to see the owner of the hand. A small, strange person or creature stood before him. The spirit was as small and thin as a child, but there was something about it that reminded Scrooge of an old, wise, ancient man. Its hair was pure white, like an old man's, and very long. However, this was not the spirit of an old man. The spirit's skin was as young, smooth, and soft as a child's. Its arms and hands were white and very strong-looking, as if it could grab you and hold on tightly. The spirit's legs and feet were just like a child's, and they were bare, just like the arms and hands. It wore a small white dress and a beautiful belt. In its hand there was a piece of holly plant, with beautiful red berries and fresh green leaves. This plant is a symbol of Christmas. However, the strangest thing about the little spirit's appearance was its head. A bright, clear light shone from the top of the spirit's head, and it was this light that allowed Scrooge to see the spirit in the dark room. In its other hand, the spirit carried a little cap. Scrooge wondered if the cap put out the light when the spirit wore it. But as Scrooge stared at the strange visitor, he had to admit that the light coming from the top of the spirit's head was not its strangest quality. The belt around the spirit's dress sparkled brightly, and it seemed to Scrooge that parts of the spirit's body disappeared and then appeared again in the darkness. He was never looking at the spirit's entire body at once. only at its arms or legs or head. But just when Scrooge thought that the spirit had disappeared entirely, it would come back again and be as clear as ever. "Are you the first spirit which Marley's ghost said would visit me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The spirit's voice was soft, gentle, and clear, like a child's. Scrooge noticed that the voice seemed to come from far away, even though the spirit was standing next to his bed. "Who are you, then? What do you want?" demanded Scrooge. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," said the visitor. "Are you the ghost of the long ago past?" asked Scrooge. "No, I am the ghost of your past," said the ghost. Scrooge did not understand this. Suddenly, for some reason that he did not understand, he wanted to see the ghost with its little cap on. But when he asked the ghost to do this, the ghost only looked at him and said, "What? Why are you so quick to put out the light I give? You are always in the darkness," it said, looking around the room. Then Scrooge asked why the ghost had come. "I have come to help you," said the ghost. Scrooge thought to himself that he wished the ghost had come in the daytime so that he could sleep, but the ghost knew what he was thinking. "I have come to save you, then. Remember this." Then the ghost put out its small, strong hand and took Scrooge's arm. "Stand up and walk with me," it said. Scrooge knew it was useless to protest and say that it was too late at night and too cold, or that he was in his sleeping clothes, or was an old man, or that he was ill, or many other things. Although the spirit's touch was gentle, Scrooge knew he had to do what the ghost said, so he got out of bed. The ghost took him over to the bedroom window. "Good spirit, I am a human man. I cannot float through the air as you can." "I will certainly fall," said Scrooge. "You will not fall. Hold my hand, and it will keep you safe," said the ghost. So Scrooge and the ghost passed through the window of his house. Scrooge was astonished to see that they were not floating through the air. They were not even in London any more. The darkness and fog had vanished. Instead, Scrooge was standing on a country road. It was a clear, cold winter day, and the sun was shining. The thick snow sparkled on the ground. He gave a great cry of surprise. "Why, I know this place! I grew up here. I was a child here." As Scrooge looked around him at the beautiful winter day, he clasped his hands together. Color came into his pale old face. The ghost was no longer holding his hand, but somehow Scrooge could still feel the spirit's touch. It burned a little like cold ice. All around him, Scrooge seemed to hear the sounds of his past, and there were many smells in the fresh, cold air. Each smell and sound reminded Scrooge of memories, things he had not thought of in years. The ghost of Christmas past was observing Scrooge. "Your lip is trembling," it said. "And what is that upon your cheek?" "It's nothing," said Scrooge. "Please, ghost, where are we going? Take me wherever you want." "Do you remember the way?" asked the ghost. "Remember the way? Oh, yes. I could walk these paths if I was blind," cried Scrooge. "Then it is strange that you have forgotten them for so many years," said the ghost. "Let us go." Scrooge and the ghost walked along the road. Scrooge knew every tree and little house along the way. Soon they saw a small village that sat next to a river. 5 or 6 little horses appeared on the road, and some young boys were riding them. The boys laughed and talked to each other so cheerfully that the crisp, fresh air seemed to sing. "Can they see us? Should I speak to them?" Scrooge asked the ghost. "No, those children and everything around you are only shadows of things that once were, shadows of your past," said the ghost. The boys riding the horses came nearer, and Scrooge remembered the names of every one of the children. As they parted from each other, they called out to each other, "Merry Christmas! Merry Christmas!" Scrooge heard two of them talking about the wonderful things they would do that day. Now, dear reader, if you had been watching Scrooge at this moment, you might think it was strange to see Scrooge's cold eyes shine and his soft smile when he heard the boys say Merry Christmas. After all, you and I both know that Scrooge did not care about Christmas. He hated Christmas. What was the good of Christmas, as he always liked to say? "Although it is afternoon, the school is not yet empty," said the ghost. "One child still sits inside alone, with no friends." "I know it, cried Scrooge and sobbed. Soon Scrooge and the ghost reached the schoolhouse. It was a large brick building, very old and dirty. There were chickens running around in the front yard. They entered the building and passed through many cold, empty rooms. All the children had left the school and gone home to be with their families, all except one. In one of the rooms, a young boy sat in front of a small fire, reading a book. Scrooge cried out, and some tears rolled down his face. The boy was Ebenezer Scrooge himself when he was young. The schoolroom was so quiet that Scrooge could hear the noises of the mice in the walls. The ghost touched Scrooge on the arm and pointed to the young boy, who had not even looked up from his book. He was reading 1,001 Nights. Suddenly, Scrooge saw a man in colorful foreign clothing appear outside the window. He had dark skin and hair, and had a long sword on his belt. He was leading a donkey by a rope. Suddenly the schoolroom was filled with the characters from the book. Scrooge wondered if this was the ghost's magic. "Why, it's dear old Ali Baba!" cried Scrooge, pointing to the man with the donkey. "I loved this book when I was younger. Look, don't you see him? And over there are Orson and Valentine. And there's that man who fell asleep at the gate of Damascus. What was his name? I remember the story. And there's the Sultan's servant, who was turned upside down by the genie. That was his punishment for trying to marry the beautiful princess." If the many businessmen and lawyers of London had seen the terrible old Scrooge, laughing and crying at the same time, talking about characters from a book he had read when he was young, they would have thought it was very, very strange. The Scrooge they knew would never talk about such things, and he would never look so happy and excited. "Oh, look, good ghost, there's the parrot from Robinson Crusoe," cried Scrooge, as a colorful parrot flew around the room. "He has a green body and a yellow tail and feathers on top of his head." The parrot would shout, "Poor Robin Crusoe! Where have you been, Robin Crusoe?" And Robinson Crusoe thought it was another man. Oh, and there goes Friday, Crusoe's friend, running for his life into the forest. "Hello, hello!" Then, in the next moment, Scrooge's face grew sad, and he stared at the young Scrooge, who was still reading his book. "Poor boy," he said, looking sadly at his younger self. "I wish, but no, it's too late now," he said quietly, putting his hands in his pockets. "What do you mean? What is the matter?" asked the ghost of Christmas past. "It's nothing," said Scrooge. "It's not important. There were some little boys who came to sing a Christmas song at my office door last night. I wish I had given them something, that's all." The ghost looked at him and smiled wisely, but said nothing. "Let us see another Christmas in your past," and waved its hand in the air. Before Scrooge could respond, he saw his younger self grow larger, and the room he was sitting in became darker, colder, and dirtier. The walls cracked, the windows became dark, and the paint fell off the walls. Scrooge did not understand how everything was happening so quickly, but he knew that time was passing. As he watched his younger self grow older, he realized that he had always stayed alone at school when all the other boys left for Christmas. Scrooge and the ghost watched young Ebenezer, who now looked about 15 years old. He was not reading now. Instead, he was walking up and down the room, thinking about something. Scrooge looked at the ghost and shook his head sadly. Then he watched the door of the room. In a moment, the door opened and a little girl ran in. She ran over to the younger Scrooge and threw her arms around his neck. She kissed him and called him her
"Dear, dear older brother. I've come to take you home, dear Ebenezer,"
said the little girl, jumping up and down and laughing.
"Yes, we're going home, home, home."
"Home, little Fan? What do you mean?" asked Scrooge's younger self.
"Yes, home,"
said his sister.
"You're going home forever and ever. You don't have to stay at this terrible, dark school anymore. Father is much nicer and kinder now. And one night, when I was going to sleep, I asked him if you could come home, and he said yes. So he sent me in a carriage to find you. You'll grow up and be a man and live and work at home. And the best thing is, we'll be together for all of Christmas and have the happiest time in the world."
"You are quite a little woman, Fan," said young Ebenezer, laughing at his sister. The little girl clapped her hands and laughed. She stood on the tops of her toes to hug her brother. She was so excited that she began to pull him out the door. Young Ebenezer seemed happy to go. Suddenly, the room was filled with a loud, angry voice. "Bring down Master Scrooge's suitcase." Then the schoolmaster appeared. He was a loud and angry man, and all the boys at school were afraid of him. The schoolmaster looked at young Ebenezer and his sister as if they were little worms. But to their surprise, the schoolmaster took them into his sitting room, where he gave them some wine and cake. It was extremely cold and dark in the sitting room, and the young people were very cold, but they could not say no to the schoolmaster. After they had eaten the cake and drank the wine, the schoolmaster put young Ebenezer's suitcase into the carriage. Ebenezer and his sister thanked the schoolmaster and told him good-bye, and they were very happy to leave. The carriage went quickly down the path, which was lined on both sides with beautiful dark green trees. Snow sparkled everywhere. Scrooge could hear young Ebenezer and his sister laughing and singing in the carriage. "She was always a little thing, very delicate. She looked as though a wind would knock her down," said the ghost. "But she had a large, loving heart." "Oh, yes, she did," cried old Scrooge sadly. "I can't deny it, Spirit." "She died young," said the ghost. "But she did have children, I believe." "Yes, she had one child, a son," said Scrooge. "That's right," said the ghost. "Her child was your nephew." Scrooge looked very uncomfortable. "Yes," he answered quickly. Although Scrooge and the ghost had left the school building, Scrooge realized that they were no longer in the country. Now they were in the busy streets of a large city. Many people filled the streets, and carriages waited for passengers. No one saw Scrooge and the ghost, of course. They were invisible. Scrooge realized that it was again Christmas time because all the shops were decorated for Christmas. The ghost stopped at a certain building and asked Scrooge if he had recognized it. "Of course, I know this place," said Scrooge. "I had my first job here as a clerk." They entered the building. Scrooge saw an old man sitting behind a large high desk. The desk was so tall that if the man had been a few inches taller, he would have hit his head on the ceiling. Scrooge cried out in excitement, "Oh, Ghost! It's old Fezziwig! Fezziwig is alive again! I used to work for him." Old Fezziwig was writing something at the high desk. Suddenly he put down his pen and looked at the clock. Scrooge saw that it was 7 o'clock in the evening. Fezziwig rubbed his large hands together, stood up, and laughed a loud, cheerful laugh. The old man was large and fat, and as he laughed his stomach shook. In a loud, cheerful voice, the old man said, "Hello there, Ebenezer and Dick. Come in here." Scrooge's younger self came into the room. Ebenezer was now a young man, and with him was another young man named Dick. "Yes, it's Dick Wilkins," said old Scrooge to the ghost. "There he is. Dick liked me very much. Poor Dick." "Hello there, my boys," said old Fezziwig. "No more work this evening. It's Christmas Eve, you know. Christmas, Ebenezer. Isn't that wonderful? Now, let's clean up the office quickly now," he said, clapping his hands together. You would not believe how quickly the two young men cleaned the office. They ran around cleaning and closed up all the windows in just 10 minutes. "Now then," said old Fezziwig. He jumped down from the high desk as quickly as a cat. "Let's move the furniture around to make room for the great party." Ebenezer and Dick did this in just a few moments. They put wood on the fire and lit all the lamps until the room was clean, warm, bright, and dry. Suddenly the door opened and some musicians came in with their instruments. Then Mrs. Fezziwig, Fezziwig's wife, came in. She was as large and fat as her husband. She was smiling happily. Then her 3 daughters came in also. They were also smiling and happy. Everyone looked ready to dance. Then all the people who worked for Mr. Fezziwig came in. The housemaid came with her cousin the baker. Then the cook came with the milkman. Some young boys from the street came in, even though they didn't work for Fezziwig. Many people came into the warm, dry room. Everyone was laughing and talking together. Soon they began to dance around the room in groups of 2. The music filled the room. Suddenly old Fezziwig clapped his hands and the music stopped for a moment. "Excellent music and dancing!" he cried. The musicians began to play again, as if they would never grow tired. The party continued for many hours. There was more dancing, and then there was wine, and more dancing, and cold meats, and pies, and cakes, and beer, and much more dancing. It was the happiest party old Scrooge could remember. Soon Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig stood up to dance. They were both very good dancers, even though they were large and fat. Everyone laughed and clapped. The men went to drink more beer, and the women talked together and watched the children, who were running around the room. When it was 11 o'clock, the party ended. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig stood on each side of the door, shook hands with the guests, and wished them a Merry Christmas. Mrs. Fezziwig kissed all the children good-bye. Soon everyone had left but Dick Wilkins and young Ebenezer Scrooge. The two clerks went to their beds, which were in a small room in a corner of the building. All this time old Scrooge had been watching the party and not thinking about anything else. But how wonderful it was! He laughed when the other guests laughed, and danced with his feet and sang the songs. He wished he could eat some of the meats, pies, and drink wine or beer with the happy people. His heart and soul were in that room, and he remembered everything as if it were yesterday, and not many years ago. His eyes were always looking for his young self, and while he watched the party, Scrooge felt as if he was young again. It was only when the party ended that Scrooge remembered the ghost of Christmas past. The little spirit was standing next to him and looking at him. The light that came from the top of its head was very bright. "It is a small thing, isn't it?" said the ghost, "to make these silly people so happy." "A small thing? No, it isn't," said Scrooge. The ghost told him to listen to the two young clerks talking. They were talking about how wonderful and good old Fezziwig and his wife were. Scrooge was amazed to see his younger self, how happy he had been on that night many years ago. "You see, Fezziwig did only a small thing," said the ghost. "It didn't cost much money to have this party, not very important. Why do you think it is so wonderful?" "No, good ghost, you're wrong," cried Scrooge. He was speaking like his younger self, not his older self, but he did not realize it. "This party was a great and wonderful thing. Fezziwig is our employer. He has the power to make us happy or unhappy, to make our work difficult or easy, a pleasure or a pain. His power can be seen in his words and looks. They might not seem very important, but they are. He was very kind tonight, and none of those people will ever forget it. So, you see, the happiness he gave us was as great as if it cost a mountain of gold." Suddenly Scrooge stopped speaking. He looked as though he was thinking of something. The ghost was looking at him with large, clear eyes. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing," said Scrooge. "You are thinking of something. What is it?" said the ghost. "No, nothing is wrong. I would like to say something to my clerk, Bob Cratchit, right now. That is all," said Scrooge. Scrooge and the ghost watched as the young Ebenezer turned off all the lamps and got into bed. Suddenly Scrooge realized that they were standing outside the building in the cold night air. The ghost said to Scrooge, "My time is growing short. We must be quick." The scene changed immediately. Once again Scrooge saw himself as a younger man. He was in his 20s now. This man's face did not yet have the cold, angry look of the old Scrooge. However, it was clear that Ebenezer was beginning to change from a young, happy man to a greedy, hard man, like the Scrooge that you and I know, dear reader. There was a sharp, eager look in Ebenezer's eyes. He thought about money much of the time. He was not alone. A young, beautiful woman stood next to him. Old Scrooge saw that there were tears in her eyes as she stared at Ebenezer. Scrooge's heart jumped when he realized who the young woman was. She was his former fiancée, Belle.
"It is not important to you, is it, Ebenezer?"
Belle said softly.
"Another love has taken my place in your heart. I suppose that if this new love can make you happy and comfort you in the future, as I wanted to do, then I cannot say anything against it."
"What do you mean? What new love has taken your place?" said Ebenezer.
"The love of money,"
said Belle. "This is how the world is," said Ebenezer angrily. "There is nothing as hard as being poor, but the second a man wants to find wealth, people criticize him and call him greedy."
You fear the world too much,
Belle said gently.
all your hopes and dreams have died, except for the dream of money and success. What are you afraid of, Ebenezer? You do not talk to me the way you used to.
"I don't know what you're talking about," said Ebenezer. "Even if I do think about money a little more, who cares? Money is important. Besides, I have not changed towards you." Belle shook her head sadly.
Ebenezer, when we met, we were young. We became engaged to be married when we were poor, and happy to be poor. We planned to improve our life slowly, through hard work, but we wanted to live in happiness also. Now you are changed. You are not the man you once were.
"Oh, Belle, I was a stupid boy then," Ebenezer said loudly.
You know that your feelings for me have changed. You are different now,
she said slowly.
but I have not changed. When you and I were one in our hearts, I believed that our life together would be good. But now we are two people. I do not know you any more, so you do not have to marry me.
"Have I ever told you I didn't want to marry you?" asked Ebenezer.
No, never.
Said the young woman. "Then why are you saying all this, Belle? What is the matter with you?" said Ebenezer.
Ebenezer, you must face the truth.
Belle said, staring at him.
Your nature has changed, and your life is different. All you do is work and think about money. All the thoughts, ideas, and feelings that you used to have are gone now. Tell me, Ebenezer,
she said,
if we had not been engaged from a young age, and you met me now, would you want to marry me? I do not think so.
Young Ebenezer did not say anything for a moment. He seemed to admit to himself that she was right. But he only said, "You don't think so?"
I wish I could believe that you still loved me,
Belle said.
but I have seen the truth, and I cannot deny it. You don't love me now, Ebenezer. You know you don't. If you were free, you would never choose a poor girl like me to be your wife. I have heard you talk, and your own gain is the most important thing in your life. Or, even if you did marry me, you would regret it terribly. So, Ebenezer, we are no longer engaged. I do this because I love you. I love the man you once were.
Ebenezer was about to speak, but she turned her head away from him and continued speaking.
When I think of the past, I almost hope that you will feel pain at our separation. But I believe that you will only think of me a little. Then you will dismiss this part of your life as a dream. You will be happy that you woke up. Well, Ebenezer, I hope you will be happy in the life that you have chosen.
Then Belle turned and walked out of the room. Young Ebenezer was alone. Old Scrooge felt as if a knife was cutting his heart. "Please, old ghost," he cried, "do not show me any more of the past. Take me home. Why do you enjoy making me miserable?" "One thing more, before I leave you," said the ghost. The scene changed again. Scrooge and the ghost were in another place and time. They were in a small but comfortable and warm room, and it was winter. A beautiful young girl sat next to the fire. At first Scrooge thought that it was Belle, but it was not. Instead, it was Belle's daughter. Scrooge saw that Belle was sitting next to her daughter by the fire. She was a little older now, but still beautiful. Scrooge could hear the noise of other children in the room. There were many children, and they all laughed and played loudly. Instead of being angry, however, the mother and daughter enjoyed the noisy children and laughed at their games. Belle's oldest daughter went to play with her brothers and sisters. Scrooge had never seen such a beautiful young girl. She looked just like Belle when Belle was young. Soon they heard a knock at the door. The children held their older sister's hands and dragged her over to their father, who had just come home. A man was with him, and his arms were full of Christmas toys and gifts. The delivery man was attacked by the happy children, who reached into his pockets, grabbed all the gifts, put their arms around his neck, and kicked his legs excitedly. The children, of course, were very happy to receive their presents. Everyone had a terrible shock when Belle caught the baby putting a doll's toy into his mouth. Had the baby swallowed the little object? No, the toy was rescued just in time. There was much joy and laughter in that room on that Christmas evening. But soon the little children grew tired, and each went up to bed. What a wonderful day it had been! Scrooge watched as Belle put the baby to bed. She went downstairs and sat next to the fire. Her husband was there, and their oldest daughter was sitting with him. "I saw a friend of yours today, Belle," said her husband.
"Who was it?"
Belle asked. "Guess," said her husband.
"I can't guess,"
said Belle, laughing.
"Oh, all right. Mr. Scrooge?"
"That's right, my dear," cried the husband. "I passed his office and saw him through the window, working. Why is he working on Christmas? I think Mr. Scrooge is alone in this world. Ghost of Christmas past, take me away from this place," cried Scrooge in a sad voice. He felt that his heart was breaking. "I told you that I would show you your past. This is what it is. Do not blame me if you are unhappy," said the ghost. "Take me away," said Scrooge. "I can't stand it any more." He saw the ghost looking at him. Somehow it seemed to Scrooge that in the ghost's face he saw all the faces of his past. The light from the ghost's head was brighter than ever. "Leave me alone. Take me back to my house," cried Scrooge. Suddenly he saw the ghost's cap in his hand. He suddenly felt that he had to put out the ghost's light. It seemed as if he could not stop looking at it. Scrooge grabbed the cap and put it over the ghost's head. The ghost did not try to stop him. The ghost's body seemed to disappear, but no matter how hard Scrooge pushed the cap down, the bright light remained. Suddenly, everything went dark. Scrooge realized that he was in his own room again, lying on the cold ground. The ghost of Christmas past was gone. Scrooge stood up and realized how tired and weak he was. He felt as though he had just fought a great battle. He was terribly sleepy as well. He climbed into his bed and fell into a deep sleep immediately. Chapter 3. The Second Spirit. Suddenly Scrooge realized that he was awake again. He did not know what time it was, but he guessed that it was before 1 o'clock in the morning. Scrooge did not have any doubts that another spirit would come to find him. Quickly, he pulled the curtains back from around his bed so that he could see the bedroom. He did not want to be surprised again by another visitor, whoever he might be. Then he sat up in bed and watched the room for signs of anything strange. Now, dear reader, you and I both know that there are many strong, brave men in the world. These men always talk about the adventures they have had and say that they are afraid of nothing. They can fight well, they are talented, and they say that they are ready for anything to happen. Now, I cannot say that old Scrooge was very much like these men. He was an old lawyer, and he had never had any adventures. However, Scrooge had had some very strange experiences in the recent past. Meeting the ghost of old Jacob Marley and the ghost of Christmas past had prepared Scrooge for more strange things to happen. So I can say that on that night, as Scrooge lay in his bed waiting for the second spirit, he felt ready for anything. Nothing would have surprised him very much, from a flying baby to a terrible monster. However, although Scrooge was ready for anything, he was certainly not ready for nothing to happen. So when the large clock outside his house struck 1 o'clock, and no ghost appeared, and nothing at all happened, Scrooge began to feel very nervous. 5 minutes, then 10, then 15 minutes passed, and no ghost came. "What is happening? Was everything a strange dream?" thought Scrooge. Scrooge was so busy wondering where the second ghost was that he did not notice the bright light at first. It was shining on his bed and had lit up the whole room. When Scrooge did notice the light, he jumped out of bed and looked around the room. No one was there. All sorts of wild ideas went through Scrooge's head, but eventually he realized that the light might be coming from his sitting room. So he took a deep breath and slowly walked over to open the door. What amazing or terrible sight would he see? The second Scrooge's hand was on the door, he heard a strange voice call him by his name. "Enter, my good man," said the voice. When Scrooge entered his sitting room, he could hardly believe his eyes. It was his sitting room, there was no doubt about that. But it had changed greatly. The walls were covered with beautiful dark green branches with bright red berries. The room smelled like a fresh winter forest. There was a large, warm fire in the chimney, the kind of fire that Scrooge would never have built for himself. But the most amazing thing of all was the floor of the sitting room. The floor was covered with Christmas foods of all kinds. There were chickens, ducks, turkeys, roast meats, sweet candies, ripe fruits, and many other delicious dishes. There were large bowls filled with wine and beer. Scrooge had never seen so much food in his life. These foods and drinks were piled up on the floor in a small mountain, and on top of the pile sat a giant man who held a torch in his hand. Scrooge knew immediately that this must be the second spirit. Come in, my good man," said the ghost in a loud, cheerful voice. "Come in, so that you shall know me better." Scrooge slowly entered the room. Even though he could see that the ghost's face was red and happy-looking, and his eyes were clear and kind, he was somehow afraid to look the ghost in the eyes. Dear reader, you must understand that Scrooge had changed a little. He was not quite the same as the angry old man we first met. But Scrooge had never had parties or happy times with friends, so he felt very strange and uncomfortable. What was he supposed to do? "I am the ghost of Christmas present," said the giant man. "Look into my eyes." Scrooge looked at the ghost, and he was amazed. The ghost wore a beautiful dark green robe with white fur. The robe was so large that Scrooge could not see the ghost's figure underneath it. The ghost's feet were bare, and his head was covered with long, dark brown curls. There was a crown of leaves and berries on the head. The ghost's face was red and happy, and the eyes were large and shone like jewels. Scrooge felt that the ghost brought light and warmth to his old, dark, and cold sitting room. He had never seen anything like this before. "Well, have you ever met anyone like me before?" said the ghost of Christmas Present, laughing loudly. "No, never," said Scrooge. "So you have never met any of my family? I have many older brothers, you see," said the ghost. "Do you? Oh, ghost! How many brothers?" asked Scrooge. "More than 1,800. "That is an enormous family to take care of," said Scrooge. The ghost stood up, and he seemed like a great king. "Good ghost," said Scrooge, "take me where you want. I traveled last night with another, and I learned a lesson. If you have anything to teach me tonight, I will listen." "Touch my robe," said the ghost. Scrooge did so, and immediately the wonderful, delicious chickens, ducks, and turkeys were gone. The sitting-room disappeared also. Scrooge saw that he and the ghost of Christmas Present were standing in the middle of a street in London, and it was Christmas morning. Many people were sweeping the snow off the streets, and young boys ran around playing in the snow. Scrooge looked around him and saw that they were not in his neighborhood. On this street, the houses were small and black. They looked even darker because of the beautiful white snow all around. It was difficult for Scrooge to walk because there was mud and icy water everywhere. The sky was gray, and mist and fog hung in the streets. There was nothing very cheerful or pretty about this neighborhood. It was very poor. But it seemed to Scrooge that happiness was in the air. The people who were sweeping the snow off the streets were laughing and talking together. Sometimes they would even throw snowballs at each other, like small children. The small shops were open, and Scrooge could see the meats and fruits for sale. For some reason, the fruits and vegetables looked especially bright and delicious. There were many kinds of nuts, large and brown. Someone was roasting the nuts, and their delicious smell filled the air. There were beautiful purple onions and shiny red and green pears and apples. They looked fat and juicy, and the oranges and lemons shone like orange and yellow jewels. The meat shops had wonderful chickens, turkeys, and sausages for sale. There were even fish, fat and silver. Looking at all this beautiful food, Scrooge was beginning to feel extremely hungry. This was strange, because Scrooge had always eaten the same boring thing for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. He thought that the only nice thing about food was that it kept him alive. But he suddenly wanted to eat a juicy apple or pear and have a feast with the meats. But there were even more wonderful things for sale in other shops. Scrooge and the ghost slowly walked the little streets, and everywhere Scrooge saw delicious sweets for sale. There were beautiful spices and fresh sweet figs and plums. There were Christmas cakes with dried fruit and large sweet almonds. The scents of tea and coffee filled the air. Everywhere people were busy buying things. They were in a terrible hurry, but Scrooge noticed how cheerful all the shoppers were as they bumped into each other, dropped their things, and filled their baskets until they could not carry any more. Everyone was in a very good mood. Soon Scrooge heard the sound of church bells ringing, which meant that it was time for everyone to go to church. Men, women, and children came out of their homes. They wore their best clothing and sang Christmas songs as they walked through the cold, snowy streets to the church. At the same time, Scrooge saw that there were many poor people in the streets. They were carrying their dinners to the bakers to be cooked, because they had no ovens or stoves. The ghost of Christmas Present seemed especially interested in these poor people. The ghost told Scrooge to follow him over to the street corner. A group of poorly dressed men in thin coats were walking down the street, each carrying a plate of food. Sometimes one of them would accidentally bump into the other, and there were some angry words. The ghost took out a small bag which contained a sparkling powder inside, and as these men passed, he sprinkled some of this powder on their dinners. Immediately, everyone became cheerful again. "Well, it's a shame to argue on Christmas Day, isn't it? Merry Christmas to you, my good man," one of the men said to the other. Soon the church bell stopped ringing, and the streets grew quiet. Lights shone inside in the small, warm houses. Scrooge could see the smoke coming out of the chimneys. He imagined all the good things that were cooking inside the homes. "Ghost, what was that strange powder you sprinkled onto those poor men's dinners? They stopped arguing and became cheerful again. Is the powder magical?" asked Scrooge. "Yes, it is my magic," said the ghost. "Would the powder work to make any person happy on this day?" asked Scrooge. "Yes, but on a poor person most," answered the ghost. "Why?" asked Scrooge. "Because the poor need my magic the most," said the ghost. Scrooge thought about this for a moment. "Ghost, I am surprised at you. I did not think that you, of all the beings in the world, would want to take these people's chances for simple fun." "Me?" cried the ghost. "Well, you have taken away their way of dining on this day, the only day that these poor people can dine like others. You have closed the bakers' shops, haven't you?" asked Scrooge. "Me?" cried the ghost again. "You think I do this?" Scrooge was a little worried, because he had not meant to upset the ghost. "Forgive me if I am wrong, good ghost of Christmas present," he said. "Things like this have been done by your family before." The ghost looked at Scrooge and said firmly, "There are some on this earth of yours who think they know us, and who have done their deeds of anger, hatred, greed, and crime while using our name. They are as strange to us as if they had never lived. They are not in my family. Remember that, and blame them for those terrible acts, not me." Scrooge promised to remember, and so they traveled on to the outside of the city. Scrooge noticed something interesting about the ghost's appearance. Although he was extremely large and tall, like a giant, he was comfortable in any place, no matter how small. It seemed that he could change his size when he wanted to. He could stand underneath a low ceiling in a very small room and become quite small, or he could fill a whole room. Perhaps it was the good ghost's kind, cheerful nature, or the pleasure he felt in helping all those people who were poor, that made him take Scrooge to the house of Bob Cratchit, Scrooge's clerk. Dear reader, you remember Bob Cratchit, the quiet little man sitting in the little room in Scrooge's office, trying to write with only a candle for light, and so cold he was almost frozen. Well, now Scrooge was seeing, for the first time, the house where his clerk lived, and learning something about his life. The ghost smiled as they reached the door to Bob Cratchit's house. He took out his large torch and his little bag of magic powder and blessed the house. Although he didn't understand why, Scrooge felt glad that the ghost had done this. Bob Cratchit only received 15 small coins for a week of work. It seemed that his little house, which had only 4 rooms, needed the ghost blessing. Scrooge and the ghost entered the house. As always, they were like shadows, and none of the family could see them. First they saw Mrs. Cratchit. She was wearing an old dress that had been repaired in many places. This was because she never had any money to make a new dress. However, this dress had many ribbons on it. Ribbons are very cheap, and they can make an old dress look a little prettier. Mrs. Cratchit and one of her daughters, Belinda, put a cloth on the table. Belinda was wearing the same kind of dress as her mother. Meanwhile, Peter Cratchit, the oldest boy, stuck a fork into a pan of potatoes that were cooking on the stove. Now and then, when he thought no one was looking, he tasted a little bite of potato. Peter was wearing his father's best shirt in honor of Christmas Day. He felt very proud of himself and wished that he could show his clothing to his friends in the park. Now, the two smaller Cratchits, a boy and a girl, came running into the house. They were noisy and happy.
"Mama, we were playing in the snow outside the baker's shop, and we smelled a goose. That's our goose, isn't it, Mama?"
The girl cried out. The children were thinking happily of the delicious goose with herbs and onion, and danced around the table. They made their older brother, Peter, dance with them, so that he almost forgot the potatoes on the stove. Soon the potatoes were cooked and jumping around in the water, ready to be peeled.
"Where can your dear father be?"
Mrs. Cratchit asked the children.
"And your brother, Tiny Tim? And your sister, Martha? They weren't nearly as late last Christmas Day."
Suddenly the door opened and Martha Cratchit came in.
"Here I am, Mother,"
she said. "Hurrah, it's Martha!" cried the younger children, running to their sister. "Martha, we're going to eat a big goose, and it smells so good."
"Why, my dear, how late you are,"
said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing Martha many times. She took off Martha's coat and scarf quickly.
"Well, Mother, we had a lot of work to finish last night,"
said Martha.
"And then we had to clean up this morning." "Well, that's all right, dear, as long as you are here with us,"
said her mother.
"Now, come and sit in front of the fire and get warm."
"Wait, wait! I hear Father coming!" cried one of the little children. "Hide, Martha, so you can surprise him." So Martha went and hid, and in came Bob Cratchit. His long scarf was full of holes, and his clothes were old and worn, but his wife had made them look nicer for Christmas. Bob Cratchit had a little boy sitting on his shoulder. This was Tiny Tim. Scrooge, watching the whole scene with the ghost, was surprised to see that this poor little boy was lame and crippled. He could not walk very well. He had a crutch with him, and his thin legs were supported with an iron frame. "Where is Martha?" asked Bob, looking around the house. "She isn't coming, Father," said one of the little children. "Not coming? Not coming home on Christmas Day? But this is terrible!" cried Bob. He had almost run home from church with Tiny Tim, because he was so excited about seeing his oldest child. Martha, who was hiding in the closet, did not want to see her father so disappointed, so she ran into the room crying,
"But here I am, Father,"
and hugged him. The two younger children took Tiny Tim in to wash his hands for dinner and tell him about the goose.
"How did little Tim behave at church? Was he good?"
asked Mrs. Cratchit. "He was as good as gold," said Bob. "Even better than that. You know, Tim has always been a thoughtful little boy, because he's alone so much. He has some of the strangest and most wonderful ideas I have ever heard. When we were coming back from church, he told me that he hoped that everyone saw him in church because he was a cripple. Tim thought it might be nice for the people to remember on Christmas Day that our Lord Jesus made blind men see and lame old beggars walk." Bob's voice was trembling with emotion as he spoke to his wife, and Mrs. Cratchit shook her head in amazement at their little son. Bob's voice trembled even more with happiness when he said that Tiny Tim seemed to be growing a little stronger. Scrooge could hear Tiny Tim's little crutch moving on the floor, and his brother and sister helped him move over to his little chair by the fire. Bob began to make a special Christmas drink that was made with gin, lemons, juices, and spices. Then he put it on the fire to heat up. Peter and the 2 younger Cratchit children went to pick up the goose from the baker's. Soon they returned with it, carrying it as if it were a little baby. You might have thought that a goose was the rarest and most delicious of all birds, and truthfully, the Cratchits, being a poor family, thought that nothing could be better. Then the activity really began. Mrs. Cratchit made a sauce for the goose. Peter Cratchit mashed the potatoes and added a little salt and butter, which the family had saved especially for this day. Miss Belinda added sugar to the apple sauce, and Martha held the dinner plates in front of the fire so that they would be nice and warm. Bob took Tiny Tim to sit next to him at a corner of the table, and the 2 young children put chairs around the table for everyone. They didn't forget themselves, of course. Then the children sat down and put their hands over their mouths so that they wouldn't cry out for the goose before it was their turn to have some. At last, Martha came and put the plates on the table, and the whole family sat down to say the blessing for the food. Mrs. Cratchit brought the goose to the table. The whole family waited excitedly as she cut the goose with the knife. How wonderful it smelled! They could not stop talking about it. Even Tiny Tim banged his fork on the table and weakly cried out, "Hooray!" with the other children. There never was such a delicious bird. Bob said he thought it was the best goose in the world. The tenderness and flavor of the meat, and the crisp skin, and how big it was. And it didn't cost very much money. With the apple sauce and the mashed potatoes, it was enough food for the Cratchits and their 6 children. When Mrs. Cratchit saw one small bone left on the plate, she laughed and said that she was glad the family had eaten all the goose for once. The youngest children were so full and happy that they couldn't even speak. After Martha and Belinda had cleared away the dinner plates, Mrs. Cratchit went to bring out the Christmas pudding. This pudding was like a delicious cake with fruits and spices. She did not want anyone to watch her while she took the pudding off the stove and put it onto a plate. Suppose it was not cooked enough? Suppose it broke while she was taking it out of the pot? What if someone had climbed over the fence into the yard behind the house while they were busy eating the goose and stolen the pudding? At this thought, the 2 youngest children became angry. All sorts of terrible things were imagined. But, hello, what was this? A great cloud of steam rose that was filled with the spices and oranges and fruits and cake all mixed together. Mrs. Cratchit placed a piece of holly plant on the pudding for decoration, and then poured some liquor over the pudding. She lit a match and set the pudding on fire. The fire was a blue color because of the alcohol in the liquor, and burned brightly. Then she took the pudding inside the house to her family. She was smiling proudly. What a beautiful pudding it was! The blue flame shone brightly. After they blew out the fire on the pudding, each person in the family got a piece. How delicious it was! How sweet and spicy! Bob said that he had never eaten one like it in his life. It was the greatest thing Mrs. Cratchit had achieved since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that she was relieved, because she was worried there had not been enough flour in the pudding. Each person in the family had something to say about the pudding, but no one said that it was a very small pudding for such a large family. That would have been a terrible thing to say. None of the Cratchit children would ever have said that to their mother. At last the Christmas dinner was finished, and the plates cleared away from the table, and the floor swept. Bob put a little more wood on the fire. Bob tasted the Christmas drink he had made with the gin and lemons and said it was perfect. There were some apples and oranges to eat and some nuts. The nuts were put in the coals of the fire to roast inside their shells. Then the whole family gathered around the fire. Bob poured the drink into some little cups and passed them around. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears," he said, holding up his cup. "God bless us." The whole family repeated his words, and Tiny Tim said last of all, "Yes, God bless us, everyone." As they sat together next to the fire, Bob held his little son's thin hand tightly in his, as if he were afraid little Tim was a ghost and might disappear or be taken away from him. Scrooge looked at poor small Tiny Tim and felt an emotion he had never felt before. "Ghost," he said, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live. In the future I see an empty little chair by the fireplace, and a little crutch that has no owner lying next to that chair," said the ghost. "The future says that the child will die." "Oh, no, no, good spirit," cried Scrooge. "Please tell me that Tiny Tim will live." "If the future is not changed in some way, Tiny Tim will die," said the ghost, a little sadly. "But what of it? If he is going to die, he should hurry up and do it. He is weak and sick. As you said yourself, the population is too large. A few more deaths won't hurt." Scrooge hung his head. He remembered what he had said to the gentlemen in his office, the men who had asked him to give money to the poor. How terribly he had acted! Scrooge's heart was filled with shame and sadness. The ghost of Christmas Present looked deep into Scrooge's eyes. "Ebenezer Scrooge," he said, "if you are a man and not a statue made of cold stone, do not say things like that again until you discover what the truth really is. Can you decide who should live and who should die? Have you never thought that perhaps, in the eyes of God in heaven, men like you are more worthless and deserve to live less than millions of others, like this poor man's sick child? It is as if you are a rich man on top of a mountain, saying there is too much life on the planet, when your hungry brothers are sitting below you in the dirt." Scrooge turned his face away and bent his head even lower at the ghost's words. He looked at the ground, feeling terrible. The ghost was right, but he raised his head up when he heard his name. "Well, a toast to Mr. Scrooge," Bob Cratchit was saying. "Mr. Scrooge is the buyer of this feast."
"The buyer of this feast?"
cried Mrs. Cratchit angrily. Her face turned red.
"I wish that man was here right now. I would—"
"My dear," said Bob, "think of the children. It's Christmas Day." He did not want the children to see their mother so angry.
"Only on Christmas Day could a person drink to the health of such a terrible, greedy, hard, unkind old man as Mr. Scrooge,"
said Mrs. Cratchit.
"Oh, Robert, you know how he is."
But Bob only said gently, "My dear, it's Christmas Day."
"Well, I'll drink to Mr. Scrooge's health for your sake and for Christmas Day,"
said Mrs. Cratchit.
"but not for his. So, a long life for Mr. Scrooge, a Merry Christmas, and a Happy New Year. But I doubt he will have either."
The children also drank to Mr. Scrooge's health, but no one was very happy about it. Tiny Tim drank last of all, and looked especially sad. You see, dear reader, Scrooge was something like a terrible monster to the Cratchit children. A monster who made their father work too hard for almost no money. The mention of Scrooge's name made everyone quiet for a few minutes. But then the unhappiness went away as if it had never happened. Bob told his family that he had found a job for Peter. He would earn a whole 5 and 6 in a week. The 2 young children laughed loudly at the thought of their brother Peter being a man of business. Peter himself stared at the fire and looked as if he was thinking very hard about what he should do with all that money. Martha, who worked at a miller's, told her family all about the sort of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at one time. She intended to lie in bed tomorrow morning, resting, because tomorrow was a holiday for her, and she would stay at home. She told them how a few days ago, when she was out, she had seen a great lord and lady of London.
"The Lord was about as tall as Peter,"
she said, and the whole family laughed, because Peter was not very tall.
"I've never seen such clothes in my life. They were so beautiful. I can't imagine how much money they cost,"
she said, and her mother sighed. There was almost never enough money for the family to have new clothes. While everyone was talking, they passed around the roasted nuts and drank many glasses of the Christmas drink, which warmed their bodies. After a while they sang a song about a lost child traveling in the snow. Tiny Tim sang the song especially well, and he had a sweet voice. There was nothing very beautiful or fancy about this family, their house, or what they were doing. The people in the family were not beautiful. They were not well dressed, and their shoes did not keep out the snow or rain. Their clothes were very poor. I am sure that young Peter Cratchit knew what the inside of a pawnbroker's store, where people go to sell their possessions for money, looked like. But this family was loving and kind, and they were happy and grateful for what little they had. They were happy that it was Christmas, and they could all be together. As Scrooge and the ghost of Christmas Present left the house, the Cratchit family's faces shone in the light of their fire and the light of the ghost's torch. Scrooge kept his eyes on all of them, but especially Tiny Tim, until he could not see them any more. Scrooge and the ghost walked the cold city streets once again. It was snowing heavily, and it was getting dark. Scrooge and the ghost passed many houses, and Scrooge saw the brightness of the fires in the kitchens and sitting rooms. There were large, beautiful houses, and small, poor ones. In one house, the firelight showed people preparing a warm dinner, and in another, some beautiful red curtains were being closed to shut out the dark and cold. At one house, Scrooge watched as all the little children ran out into the snow to be the first to greet their older relatives who had come to dinner. Sisters, aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, the whole family. There were shadows on the window of guests eating and drinking, and in the street Scrooge saw a group of young ladies walking down the street to a party at their neighbor's house. They had red cheeks, blue eyes, and curly hair. They were all talking at once. They were quite pretty, and they knew it. I suppose they were wondering about the young men they would meet at the party. It seemed to Scrooge that there were so many people on their way to Christmas parties and dinners that there might not be anyone home to greet them when they got there. But there were just as many people expecting company, and every house had a bright, warm fire all ready for their guests. How happy the ghost of Christmas Present was! Wherever the ghost walked, he spread his beautiful green robe and brought laughter and happiness to all the people nearby, even though they could not see him. He waved his torch around and laughed and danced. When the ghost passed a boy who was lighting the street lamps, the boy laughed aloud, although he didn't know why. Perhaps he laughed just because it was a beautiful Christmas evening. Then, all of a sudden, The whole scene changed without a word of warning from the ghost. Scrooge realized that they were standing on a wide, flat field outside the city. It was dark and cold, but the red sun shone its last light on some large stones on the flat ground. The stones were large and tall. There was a stream with frozen water in it. Everywhere there was dead grass. It was a terrible, lonely, frightening place. "What is this place, ghost?" asked Scrooge. "This is a place where miners live," answered the ghost. "They work under the ground, digging for stone and coal. Their life is hard and terrible, more terrible than you can imagine. But they know me. You'll see." They walked towards a very tiny wooden house sitting in the middle of the field. Inside there were many people gathered around a fire. There was an old lady and man, and their children, and their grandchildren, and even their great-grandchildren. They were all gathered around the fire, trying to keep warm. But although the little fire was not enough, and the small children shivered, the whole group was celebrating Christmas. The old man was singing a very old Christmas song. He had learned it when he was just a small boy long ago. Now and then some of the other people would sing with him. Scrooge wondered how all these people were able to feed themselves, and how these poor people could take care of their children. But the ghost did not want to stop there. "Hold on to my robe," he said to Scrooge. Scrooge felt a little afraid. Where was the ghost going to take him now? Scrooge had a feeling he wasn't going to like it. He held on to the ghost's robe, and they began to fly. Where were they going? To the ocean? They were flying over the water. Scrooge shut his eyes and prayed he wouldn't fall. Then Scrooge heard the loud water crash against some rocks, and opening his eyes, he saw a little house on a beach. There were 2 old sailors sitting inside the house. Although they were alone, they sat at their little table, their tough old hands each holding a cup of beer, and wished each other a Merry Christmas. Then the older sailor sang a song. He looked as if he were as old and strong as the earth itself. Then they were flying over the water again, and Scrooge saw a ship below them. There were some men on the ship who were walking around. Scrooge found that he could read the men's minds. There wasn't one man on the ship who did not hum a Christmas song, or have a Christmas thought, or remember a Christmas day in his past, or think of some loved person. Every man on the ship had a good or kind thing to say to his friends, more on that day than any other day of the year. Each man had celebrated Christmas the best he could on that ship, and remembered his family, and known that they also were thinking of him. Scrooge was hanging onto the ghost's robe as if it would save his life. He was thinking about the depths of the dark black ocean below him. He was afraid to open his eyes and look around him. He could not imagine what secrets lay in the deep, cold water. What if he was to fall? He didn't want to think about it. So it was a very strange surprise to Scrooge to hear, as he listened to the wind, a loud laugh. He was so surprised that he opened his eyes. He wasn't flying above the ocean any more. Instead, he was in a warm, bright, dry room with Christmas decorations all around. Scrooge's nephew stood there. His nephew was the person who had laughed. The ghost of Christmas past was standing next to Scrooge, and smiling at Scrooge and at his nephew in a very pleased way. "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed the nephew, whose name was Fred. "Ha, ha, ha! Now, dear reader, if there is any chance that you should know a man with a louder, happier, and more wonderful laugh than that of Scrooge's nephew Fred, you should introduce that man to me. I would be very happy to meet him and become his friend too. I will tell you a great truth about the world, dear reader. Even though there is much unhappiness, suffering, sickness, and greed in the world, there is nothing more powerful than laughter and good humor. Laughter and joy are more powerful than the worst tragedy. When Fred laughed, he held his sides, rolled his head, and twisted his face. Fred's wife laughed in a similar way. All their friends and family who were at their house for a Christmas party laughed just as loudly. Ha 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 ha! The room was filled with laughter. Scrooge wondered when his nephew would stop laughing and explain what the joke was. "And then my uncle said that Christmas was stupid. Can you all believe that?" cried Fred. "And he believed it too."
"Well, shame on him then, Fred,"
said Fred's wife. She was still laughing, but she looked almost angry at the idea that anyone, even Scrooge, could think badly of Christmas. Fred's wife, bless her, was a very firm woman. She always said just what she thought. She was a very pretty woman. Many people would say she was beautiful. She had a pink and white face with wide, large eyes that always looked a little surprised. She had a little red mouth, the kind of mouth that was meant to be kissed. And it was kissed, and very often, too. Her eyes usually had a laughing look in them. As she sat there in the room, thinking about her husband's uncle Ebenezer, she looked angry. But when Fred's wife was angry, she was even prettier. Fred was very pleased with her and loved her very much. "Well, he's a funny old man," said Fred. "It's true that he isn't as nice as he could be. However, my uncle's sins have their own punishment. I have nothing bad to say about him."
"I'm sure he's rich, Fred,"
said Fred's wife.
"At least, that's what you always tell me."
"What do you mean, my dear?" asked Fred. "Uncle's money is useless to him. He doesn't do anything good with it. And he doesn't make himself comfortable with his money. I mean, he doesn't buy himself nice things or go on vacations. And, of course, he isn't giving us the money either, is he?" Fred laughed even harder at this last idea.
"Well, I'm sorry, Fred, but I have no patience with that man,"
said Fred's wife. All the other ladies in the room, especially Fred's wife's sisters, said very similar things about old Scrooge. "Oh, I have patience with him," said Fred. He looked a little more serious. "Darling, don't you understand? I am so sorry for him. I can't be angry with him, not even if I tried. The only person who has ever suffered because of Uncle's unkindness is Uncle himself. I'm serious. He's decided not to like us, and he won't come and eat dinner with us on Christmas Day or any other day. And what are the results of that? He's missing an excellent dinner."
"Oh, yes, he is,"
said Fred's wife.
"He is missing a good dinner."
All the other guests agreed with her. I am sure that they were right about this, because the plates and bowls on the table were empty. The guests had eaten all the food. "Well, I'm very happy to hear it," said Fred, who was standing by the fireplace. "You see, I wasn't sure that our housekeepers were good cooks. What do you think, Topper?" he asked a man standing next to him. Topper was very interested in one of Fred's wife's sisters. He smiled and said that he was a bachelor, and a bachelor was a terrible thing to be. He didn't have any right to express an opinion on the subject of housekeepers until he was married. Fred's wife's sister turned red and couldn't stop smiling.
"Finish what you were saying, Fred,"
said Fred's wife, smiling.
"He never finishes what he starts to say. He's such a silly man."
Fred began to laugh again, and everyone else in the room laughed too, except one of the sisters. She was trying to look like a lady, all for Mr. Topper. "Well, my dear," said Fred, "I was going to say before that Uncle Ebenezer doesn't like us and doesn't want to spend time with us. The result of that choice is that he loses many happy moments, which wouldn't hurt him. They would help him. I am sure that he can find nicer friends here in our house than he can find in his dark old office or his dusty house. So, you see, I will ask my uncle to dine with us every year, whether he likes it or not. I am sorry for him. He can say all the bad things about Christmas he wants, but I am sure he will begin to like Christmas if he sees me going to his office year after year, happy and cheerful, and saying, 'Hello, Uncle, how are you? Come and eat with us.' Even if I can only give my uncle the idea to give his poor clerk some extra money, I'll be happy. And do you know, friends, I think I changed his mind a little when I saw him yesterday." Everyone in the room laughed at the thought of anyone changing Scrooge's mind. That would never happen. Poor Fred was a fool if he thought mean old Ebenezer Scrooge would change. But Fred was a very good, friendly man, and he didn't really care if they laughed at him. Instead, he laughed too, and passed the bottles of wine around the room with much joy. After this conversation, Fred and his wife served tea to their guests. Then they had some music. This was a very musical family who loved to sing and dance. Fred and his wife had very nice voices and danced beautifully. Topper had an especially nice deep voice, and Fred's wife played the harp just like an angel. She played many tunes that evening. Scrooge, who was standing with the ghost of Christmas present and watching the scene, remembered one the best. It was a song that Scrooge's sister had sung when they were young. When Scrooge heard Fred's wife playing this old song, memories of his dear sister filled his mind. All the things that the ghost of Christmas past had shown him were also in his head. As Scrooge stood there, he thought to himself that if he could have listened to that song more often when he was younger, he might have been a different person. Maybe he could have learned how to be happy, loving, and kind like his sister had been. Perhaps he could have made his life better instead of working too much like poor old Jacob Marley. Scrooge felt his heart becoming softer. Oh, if only his sister had lived! However, the guests did not spend the whole evening playing music. After a while they played some games. Even though everyone there was an adult, it is good to play like children sometimes, and there's no better time to play than at Christmas time. They played games of cards and then a game called Blind Man's Bluff. In this game, you had to put a cloth over your eyes and try to find people without seeing them. It was clear that Topper was very interested in finding Fred's wife's sister. I think Topper kept opening his eyes when no one was looking and seeing the sister. Then he would run over to where she was hiding and pretend he didn't know who she was. He would touch her dress and hands and face and say over and over, "Who can this be?" while the sister laughed.
"Mr. Topper, you're terrible. This isn't fair,"
she said. I am sure the sister told Topper her opinion of him when they were hiding together behind the curtains. The ghost of Christmas present thought Topper was very funny. "I see a wedding in the future," he told Scrooge, laughing. Fred's wife was not playing this game. Instead, she sat down in a comfortable chair by the fireplace. Scrooge and the ghost were standing just behind her, but of course she didn't know that. After the guests became tired of Blind Man's Bluff, they played some word games. Fred's wife was very good at word games, and she always beat her sisters at these games, even though they were also very intelligent. Topper could have told you that. Scrooge felt secretly proud that Fred's wife was winning the games. There were 20 guests at the house, young and old. Even though no one could hear his comments, Scrooge joined in the games with everyone else. He forgot that no one could hear or see him, so he sometimes spoke quite loudly. He was having so much fun that for a little while he forgot that the ghost of Christmas Present was standing next to him. When Scrooge finally noticed the ghost, he was smiling at Scrooge in a pleased way. The ghost looked happy to see that Scrooge was enjoying himself. Scrooge begged the ghost to stay for one more game, like a small child. The ghost said, "We cannot. Our time is becoming short." "Oh, but they're starting to play a new game," Scrooge cried. "Let's stay for half an hour and no more." This new game was called Yes and No. Scrooge's nephew had to think of something or someone, and the other guests had to guess what or who it was. Fred could only answer yes or no to their questions. The guests began to ask their questions. It seemed that Fred was thinking of an animal who walked the streets just like a man and who was mean like a bear. But he wasn't a bear. He talked sometimes, and he lived in London. He wasn't a cat or a tiger or a dog or a horse. When the guests asked Fred their questions, Fred always began to laugh loudly. Finally, Fred's wife's sister, the one Topper liked, jumped up.
"I know who it is, Fred,"
she cried. "Who?" asked Fred, smiling.
"It's your Uncle Scrooge."
"That's right," cried Fred. Everyone laughed loudly. "Well, friends, poor old Uncle Scrooge has made us laugh a lot tonight," said Fred, holding a glass of wine. "It wouldn't be nice not to drink to his health, so I say, here's to Uncle Scrooge." "Yes, here's to Uncle Scrooge," everyone cried. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to Uncle Scrooge, wherever he is," said Fred. "He wouldn't take my wishes for a happy holiday, but he'll have them whether he wants them or not. Here's to Uncle Scrooge." While he was watching the games, Uncle Scrooge had become so happy and cheerful that he would have thanked Fred for his kind words with a speech that no one could hear, except himself and the ghost. But there was no time. Before Scrooge knew it, the ghost had taken him away again. They saw many other things that night. They watched people celebrating Christmas all over the world. They traveled far, even to strange foreign countries. They saw many men and women, mothers and fathers, old people and young people. The ghost of Christmas Present stood next to sick people lying in their beds, and they became happy. He took Scrooge to visit poor men who were patient and hopeful for better lives. They were happy, knowing it was Christmas, and they were alive and healthy. They saw churches, hospitals, and prisons, and everywhere they went, the ghost blessed the people inside. It was a long night. It seemed to Scrooge that he had been with the ghost for a long, long time. Was it hours, days, or years they had been together? Scrooge did not know. Finally, the ghost turned to Scrooge and said, "Tonight, at midnight, I will leave you. Listen. The time is almost here." Scrooge heard a clock's bell. It was 15 minutes until midnight. He realized that they were back in London and standing in the middle of a dark, misty street. Scrooge looked closely at the ghost. he had noticed something very strange. "Ghost, please forgive me for what I'm about to ask you," he said, "but I see something strange underneath your robe. Would you show me what it is?" The ghost opened his green robe. Scrooge cried out in surprise. There were two small children, a boy and a girl, sitting at the ghost's feet. But these were no ordinary children. They did not look like Bob Cratchit's children, who had pink cheeks and bright eyes. These children looked more like animals, thin, hungry animals. Their skin was yellow, and their bodies were horribly thin. Their bones showed through their skin, and their hands and feet were like claws. They looked mean, angry, and ugly, but also frightened. It was terrible. Scrooge did not know what to think. He tried to say something kind, but the words stopped in his throat. He could not lie. He had never seen anything as horrible as these children. Surely they were not human. "Ghost of Christmas Present, are these strange children yours?" asked Scrooge. "No, they are man's children," said the ghost quietly. "Humans have made these children the way they are. They have come to me seeking help. The boy is named Ignorance, and the girl is Want. They suffer because of the sins of humans. You must watch out for them both. You do not want them to appear in your life. But most of all, watch out for this boy Ignorance. Now, you have seen the suffering of these children. Do not pretend that you don't know them. You see, Ebenezer Scrooge, in this boy's eyes, I see the future. I see the death and misery of all mankind, unless the good people of the world, the people who know, decide to do something. But how terribly these poor children suffer! Oh, alas for all the poor unhappy people of the world!" Scrooge cried. He understood what the ghost was trying to tell him. These children represented all the miserable, hungry, poor people of the world. It was just like the ghost of Christmas past had told him. Somehow, these thin, horrible-looking children were the people sitting in the dirt, while Scrooge was the rich man on top of the mountain. "Won't someone help them?" he cried loudly. There was no answer. Scrooge looked around quickly. The ghost and the strange children were gone. The dark streets were silent, and the cold fog filled the air. The clock's bell struck 12. It was midnight. Suddenly Scrooge remembered the words of old Jacob Marley. "The third spirit will arrive on the third night at midnight." When the sound of the clock stopped, he looked up and saw a tall, dark figure with a black robe and a hood coming towards him. Chapter 4. The Last Spirit. The third ghost slowly and silently walked towards Scrooge. When it stopped in front of him, Scrooge bent down on one knee before it, as if he were its servant. He didn't know why he did this. He only knew that this ghost was very different from the other two. It seemed to spread darkness and mystery through the air. The ghost wore a dark black robe which hid its face, its figure, and everything else except one white hand. Scrooge couldn't even see its eyes behind its hood. It was like looking into a deep black hole. If that one white hand had not been there, it would have been difficult to see the ghost in the darkness. However, when it stood in front of him, Scrooge thought that the ghost was very tall. He knew nothing more, because the ghost did not speak or move. He only knew that this ghost filled his heart with a strange, terrible fear. "Are you the ghost of Christmas future?" Scrooge asked the black figure. The ghost did not speak. It raised its white hand and pointed ahead into the mist, as if to tell Scrooge to follow it. "You are going to show me parts of the future, things that have not yet happened?" asked Scrooge. He needed to hear the ghost speak. Oh, if only it would speak to him. The ghost's silence frightened Scrooge more than anything else. The ghost did not answer Scrooge, but Scrooge thought he saw the ghost's hood move a little, as if the thing inside had nodded its head. That was the only answer he got. Then it raised its white hand again and pointed ahead of them. Dear reader, can you imagine how Scrooge felt? At this point in our story, Scrooge was very familiar with ghosts. Old Jacob Marley and the ghosts of Christmas past and present had surprised him at first, but he had been able to have conversations with them. They had answered his questions, and they weren't even very frightened. But this ghost, Scrooge feared it so much that he could not move. It was as silent and black as death. His knees were shaking, and he could barely walk. The black shape paused for a minute, as if it knew how Scrooge felt, and was giving him time to recover. But Scrooge felt even more afraid. He imagined that behind the ghost's black hood there were sharp eyes looking closely at him. But even though Scrooge stared as hard as he could into the ghost's hood, all he could see was a ghostly white hand and one large heap of blackness. "Ghost of the future," Scrooge said, "I fear you more than any other ghost I have met. But I know that, like the other ghosts, your purpose is to help me. And because I hope to be a different man from the man I was, I will go with you, and do it with a grateful heart. Please, will you speak to me?" The spirit said nothing. It only pointed ahead with its white hand. "Lead me, ghost," said Scrooge. "The night is disappearing, and it is precious time to me. Take me wherever you must take me." The ghost of Christmas future turned and walked through the mist. Scrooge followed behind it. He did not touch the black robe, but it somehow seemed to carry him along through the air. All of a sudden, they were standing in the very center of London on a busy street. There were many rich merchants hurrying along the streets. Scrooge could hear the coins moving in their pockets. Sometimes they stopped to speak to each other. They looked at their large gold watches and played with the gold in their pockets while they talked. The ghost stopped beside one group of merchants and pointed to them. Scrooge realized that the ghost wanted him to listen to their talk, so he walked over to them. "No," said a large fat man with a red face. "I don't know anything else about it. I only know that he's dead." "When did he die?" asked another man. "Last night, I think." "Well, what was the matter with him?" said a third man. He took a pipe out of his pocket and began to smoke it. "I thought he was 100 years old. I thought he'd never die." "Well, only God knows why," said the fat man. He yawned as if he thought the conversation was boring. "What has he done with all his money?" said another man. Scrooge knew the man. He had done business with him. He hadn't realized before how ugly and greedy the man looked. "I don't know," said the fat man. "Maybe he left it to his company." All I know is he hasn't given it to me." The other men laughed at this. "I think it will be a very cheap funeral," the fat man continued, "because I don't know anyone who will go to it. Why don't we all go?" The ugly man laughed. "Well, I guess I'll go to the funeral, but only if they provide lunch." Everyone laughed even louder. "Well, I don't care about his funeral at all," said another gentleman. "I never wear black clothing, and I never eat lunch. What did he ever do for me? But if everyone else is going, I'll go too. Actually, I think maybe he liked me, because we used to stop and speak whenever we met. Well, goodbye." All the men went away on their own business. Scrooge looked at the black ghost for an explanation, but of course he got no answer. He did not know who the men had been talking about, who the dead man was. Silently, the ghost moved down the street. It stopped in front of two different gentlemen talking together, and raised its white hand. Scrooge knew these two men very well, because he had done business with them many times. They were very rich and important men. In his life, Scrooge had always made sure that he worked with the most rich and successful men in London. He always hoped to make money off them. "Well, how are you?" said one. "I'm all right. How are you?" said the other. "Did you hear the news? Old Scratch has finally gotten what was coming to him," said the first man. "Yes, I heard that he died," said his friend. "Cold outside, isn't it?" "Yes, but it's nice. Today's Christmas Day. Do you ice skate?" "Oh, no. I'm too busy for that. Well, I have other things to do. Goodbye." And the two men parted. Scrooge did not understand why the ghost wanted him to listen to these conversations. What did they have to do with him? Who had died? However, Scrooge felt that the merchant's conversations were important somehow. The ghost would not make him listen if they were not. He wondered what their meaning was. The men could not be talking about the death of old Jacob Marley, because Scrooge was now visiting the future. Jacob Marley's death was in the past. Scrooge could not think of anyone connected with himself who was called Old Scratch. But he knew that Ghost of Christmas Future was there to teach him a lesson. "Hopefully, I will understand the Black Ghost's purpose soon," he thought. He decided to pay close attention to everything he saw and heard. He would also observe his future self when he saw him. Scrooge thought that seeing his future self would give him the answers to all his questions. He looked around everywhere for his future self, but he did not see himself anywhere. Other men sat on the benches where he used to sit. Scrooge hoped that this absence meant that the future Scrooge had changed and did not work as hard as he used to. The terrible ghost stood beside him, quiet and black as night. It had turned toward him, and it seemed to be waiting for him. When Scrooge stopped looking for his future self in the street, he imagined that the ghost's eyes were looking at him closely once again. Why? What was it thinking? What secrets did it know? Scrooge shook and felt very cold inside. Scrooge and the ghost left the busy streets and went to a strange part of town which Scrooge did not know. It was a very poor area, but it was not at all like the Cratchit family's neighborhood. That area of London had been poor, but its people were good and friendly. This neighborhood had many criminals and bad people living in it, and it was dirty and dangerous. No one thought of Christmas here. It was difficult to survive. The streets smelled bad, and the dirty shops and houses had broken windows. The people on the street were almost naked. They were drunken, mean, and ugly. Dogs, cats, and children sat in piles of garbage looking for food. The whole area was filled with too many people, and the air seemed to smell of crime, dirt, and misery. Deep inside this terrible neighborhood there was a small shop where people went to buy rags, pieces of iron, and even pieces of terrible old meat and bones that the butchers threw away. Sometimes people bought them for soup. Scrooge and the ghost entered this shop next. On the shop's floor there were piles of chains, keys, boxes, and bits of machines. There were piles of old papers and dirty rags everywhere. Everything seemed to be covered with a layer of grease. There were piles of fat and old bones sitting in buckets. Who knew how many rats, mice, insects, and worms lived in that shop? I don't like to think about it. Sitting amongst all these things was an old man about 70 years old. He sat in a chair next to a small stove. He was wrapped in a thin blanket, if you could call it a blanket. It was more like a dirty piece of cloth with many holes. But the man did not seem to care. He smoked a pipe calmly. Just as Scrooge and the ghost entered the room, the door opened and an old woman came in. She carried a heavy bag in her arms. Then another woman came in, also holding a bag. The two women stared at each other in surprise, but before they could speak, the door opened again and a man dressed in black entered. He had a bag like the others. They all stared at each other and burst out laughing.
"Well, imagine meeting you two here,"
said the first woman to the other two.
"Look, Joe, isn't this funny? We all arrived here at the same time by accident."
Joe was the old man. "Well, isn't that convenient?" said Joe. "Come in. Let me shut the door of the shop, and then we can do some business. How noisy the door is. There's no piece of metal in this shop older than this door, and there aren't any bones in here older than mine. Ha, ha, come in, come in." The four people went and sat down next to the stove. Joe put some coal on the fire, and then sat down in his chair and began to smoke his pipe once again. After a moment, the first woman threw down her heavy bag.
"Well, Joe, there it is,"
she said. She looked at the other people in the room almost angrily.
"Everyone has a right to take care of themselves. Every person has a right to make money. I know he certainly did." "That's true,"
said the other old woman.
"He was a rich old man."
"Well, of course," said old Joe. "Don't stand there staring as if you were afraid, woman. We're not going to tell the police, are we?"
"Oh, no,"
said the others.
"Well, it's not as if he needs these things now. He's dead,"
said the first woman.
"He was a strange old man. He must have been very terrible. I heard he died all alone, with no one in the room with him. Well, open the bag, Joe. Let me know the value of what is inside. You can tell me the truth. I don't care that the others are watching. We knew we were taking his things. He was an awful, mean old man. So it isn't a sin. Open it, Joe."
But the man in black held up his hand and opened his bag first. Inside his bag were some strange objects. There were a few boxes and an old picture. Joe looked at each of the objects. and told the man how much money they were worth. It wasn't very much money. Then the second woman opened her bag. Her name was Mrs. Dilber. She had some bed sheets and towels, a few silver spoons, and some boots. Joe counted the objects and told her how much money he would pay for them. Mrs. Dilber received a little more money than the man had. "I always give too much money to you ladies. It's a problem of mine. That's why I'm so poor," said Joe to Mrs. Dilber, laughing. "Now, don't ask me for any more, or I'll be sorry for my kindness."
"And now look inside my bag, Joe,"
said the first woman. Joe opened the first woman's bag. Inside was a large, heavy black sheet. "What is this?" asked Joe. "It looks like a bed curtain."
"That's exactly what it is,"
said the woman. Bed curtains hung around people's beds in the old days. Joe looked surprised. "Did you take these curtains from his bed while he was lying there and dying?"
"Yes, I certainly did,"
said the woman.
"Why not take them?"
"Well, you'll certainly be successful at this job," said Joe.
"Well, I wasn't going to miss the opportunity,"
said the woman.
"He didn't need them. He was almost dead when I got there. Besides, think of the kind of man he was. He would probably have done the same thing, if it would help him. And look, here are some of his blankets. He isn't going to catch a cold without them."
"I hope he didn't die of a sickness. We might catch it," said Joe.
"Oh, don't worry about it,"
said the woman.
"Here's his best shirt. There aren't any holes in it, and the material is very nice. It was lucky that I saved it. Someone wanted to bury him in the shirt, but I took it off his body at the last moment. I said he should be buried in an uglier shirt, because the worms were going to eat it up anyway."
Scrooge listened to this conversation and felt terrible. These people had stolen some poor dead man's things from his house, even the clothes off his body. These people were terrible. But who was the dead man? Scrooge knew that the ghost of Christmas future would give him no answers. Joe gave a bag of money to the woman. It was more than the others had received.
"Ha ha!"
laughed the woman.
"That man had no friends when he was alive. So now we can get rich from his death. There's no one who cares about his house or his things."
"Ghost of Christmas future," cried Scrooge. "I understand now. If I do not change myself, my life will end just like this poor dead man has ended." Suddenly the scene changed. Scrooge was standing in a dark, cold room. In front of him was a bed, and on the bed something lay. It was covered with a sheet. The black ghost stood next to the bed, and its white hand pointed at the thing on the bed. Scrooge was terribly afraid. He knew what lay on the bed. It was the dead man. Here he lay on his bed. No one cared about the body. There were no friends or family in the room. The man had died alone, and no one was sorry. Only the thieves had come to steal from him. "Is there anything more terrible?" thought Scrooge. The dead man's face was covered with the sheet, and Scrooge knew that all he had to do was lift the sheet, and he would see the man's face. He knew the ghost wanted him to see the dead man's face, but he could not lift the sheet. He was too afraid. He did not have the courage to look at the man's face. He wondered what the man's last thoughts had been before he died. If he was alive right now, what would he be thinking about? Probably his money and his business and things like that." Scrooge turned to the black, silent ghost. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "please, let us leave this horrible room. I have learned an important lesson. This man died alone because he did not love others in life. He became rich, but he was really poor because he had no friends or family. Please, believe me, I will not forget him. Let's leave this place." The ghost said nothing. Its white hand still pointed to the bed. "I understand what you want me to do, oh ghost," said Scrooge, "but I cannot do it. Forgive me, ghost, forgive me." Once more Scrooge felt as if the ghost's eyes were looking at him. "Please, ghost, if there is any person in this world who feels something about this man, show him to me," cried Scrooge. The ghost lifted its dark robe for a moment, like a bird's wing. Then Scrooge saw that they were standing in a different room. It was daytime, and a mother and her children were sitting by a fire. The mother seemed to be waiting for something, because she walked up and down the room. She had a worried look on her face. Scrooge thought that she was probably expecting a guest, because she looked at the clock every few minutes. The noisy children were playing in the next room, but she did not pay attention to them. Finally, the door opened and the woman's husband came in. Usually he had a serious, sad face. The man looked older than he was, because he had a very hard life. He worried about many things, but mostly about money and how he would feed his family. But now Scrooge saw that the man looked almost happy. He sat down at the table and began to eat the dinner that his wife had cooked for him. After a little while, she spoke to her husband in a quiet voice.
"Is the news good or bad?"
"It is bad, Caroline," said her husband.
"Oh, no! Is our family ruined?"
asked Caroline. "There is still hope," said her husband.
"If he helps us, there is hope. But that would be a miracle,"
said Caroline sadly. "He cannot help us any more," said Caroline's husband. "He is dead." Caroline's face looked almost happy. She cried out,
"Oh, thank God!"
and then immediately was sorry and apologized. She did not want to thank God for someone's death, but she couldn't help it. She was very relieved. Her husband explained the situation to her. "I went to his office to ask for another week to find the money. I was very afraid," he said. "But they told me he was very ill and almost dead, and he died last night."
"Who will we pay the debt to now? And when do we have to pay it?"
asked Caroline. "I don't know," said her husband. "But we will have the money by that time, and I am sure that the next man will be a better and nicer one than he was. We can sleep well tonight, Caroline." And the man hugged his wife. The little children came into the room. They did not understand why their parents were happy, but they hadn't seen their father look so well in a long time. These people were happier because of this man's death. Scrooge felt terrible. "Oh, ghost, let me see something good and loving about death," Scrooge said. "Otherwise, the thoughts of this dead man, who was cruel and greedy in life, and whom no one cares for in his death, will stay in my mind forever." Again the ghost of Christmas future raised its white hand and pointed out the door. Scrooge followed the ghost as it walked slowly through the streets of London. Soon they were in an area he knew. It was Bob Cratchit's neighborhood. The ghost entered Bob Cratchit's home, and Scrooge saw Mrs. Cratchit and her children sitting around the fire. What Scrooge noticed about the Cratchit house on this Christmas Day in the future was that it was very, very quiet. No one was laughing and talking, as they had on the other Christmas Day. There were no happy noises of children. The children were standing in front of the fire and quietly staring at Peter Cratchit, who had a book in his hand. Mrs. Cratchit and her daughters were sewing some little clothes. Why weren't they happy? Peter was reading aloud from the Bible. "God sent his child down to the people," he read. Scrooge remembered hearing these words when he was a little boy. Suddenly, Mrs. Cratchit put her hands over her head.
"Thank you for reading to the children, Peter. Oh, dear, my eyes hurt terribly. There isn't enough light in the room,"
she said.
"My head aches, too. But I don't want your father to know. We must be cheerful when he comes home."
Suddenly Scrooge understood. Where was Tiny Tim? "Oh, no!" he cried softly. Poor Tim was dead.
"He should have been home by now,"
said Mrs. Cratchit. "Yes, he's a little late," said Peter. "But I think he walks a little more slowly than he used to, Mother." Peter looked sad. Everyone was quiet for a moment. At last Mrs. Cratchit said in a steady, cheerful voice,
"Well, I'm sure he'll be home any minute. He used to walk very fast with Tiny Tim sitting on his shoulders."
"Oh, yes," said Peter.
"But he was very light to carry,"
said Mrs. Cratchit softly.
"and your father loved him. So it was no trouble at all."
She turned her face away from her children so they would not see the tears in her eyes. Scrooge, who was watching this sad scene, wanted to cry.
"There is your father at the door,"
said Mrs. Cratchit suddenly. She jumped up just as Bob Cratchit came inside. Mrs. Cratchit ran to pour her husband a hot cup of tea. His little children sat on his lap. They looked at their father as if to say, "Don't worry, Father. Don't be sad any more. We are still here." Poor Bob was very cheerful with his family. He asked the children about their day. He told his daughters that the clothes they had made were very beautiful. "I think they'll be done before the funeral on Sunday," he said.
"Why were you late, dear?"
Mrs. Cratchit asked her husband. "Well, I went to the church," said Bob slowly.
"Oh, Bob, did you see his resting place?"
asked Mrs. Cratchit. "Yes, my dear. It's very beautiful and peaceful there. It will be good for you to see it. Next Sunday, perhaps you can come with me. I promised Tim I would go to his grave each Sunday." "Oh, my little child," he cried suddenly. "My little, little child." And he began to cry silently. Scrooge, standing with the ghost in the shadows, felt the tears running down his face. Oh, Tiny Tim, and poor Bob and Mrs. Cratchit. Scrooge watched as Bob went up the stairs. The ghost of Christmas past suddenly raised its hand and pointed as if telling Scrooge to follow Bob. Scrooge walked up the stairs. He found Bob sitting in a little room by a bed. In the bed was the body of his son, Tiny Tim. He had died 2 days ago. Scrooge watched as Bob stared at the body of his son. Bob was thinking that he was glad his little boy was not in pain any more, and was at peace in heaven. Finally, he sighed and kissed the child's cold cheek. He felt much better. When Bob went downstairs, he was much more cheerful. The whole family sat around the fire and talked. Bob told them all about the kindness of Fred, Scrooge's nephew. I had only met him once before, but he saw me in the street today. He came over to me and said I looked a little unhappy and asked if there was anything he could do to help. I told him our son had died, and he said, "I am so sorry, Mr. Cratchit, for you and for your good wife." I don't know how he knew that.
Knew what, Bob?
Asked Mrs. Cratchit. I don't know how he knew that you were a good wife, said Bob, smiling. Well, everyone knows that, Father, cried Peter. That's exactly right, my boy, said Bob. I hope they do anyway. Well, old Scrooge's nephew is a wonderful young man. He gave me his card and said, if there is anything I can do for you and your family, please come and see me. It's not because he wants to help us, but because he was so kind that I felt better. It almost seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim.
I'm sure he's a wonderful man,
said Mrs. Cratchit. You'd believe it even more, my dear, if you met him, said Bob. I wouldn't be surprised if he finds Peter a better job.
Peter, did you hear that? How wonderful,
cried Mrs. Cratchit.
Oh, and then Peter can find a house of his own and get married,
cried Martha, Peter's sister. Oh, be quiet, said Peter, smiling and laughing. His father smiled at him. I'm sure Peter will get married some day and leave us, he said, but there's plenty of time for that. But no matter what happens, I am sure that none of us will ever forget Tiny Tim. He was the first to leave us. Never, Father, all the children cried. And I know, my dears, Bob said to his family, that we will remember how wise and patient little Tim was, even though he was only a little boy. His memory will inspire us. Oh, yes, Father, everyone said. Then, I am very happy, said Bob. I am very happy. Mrs. Cratchit wiped her eyes and kissed her husband. Then Bob's daughters kissed him, and Peter and his father shook hands. Oh, Tiny Tim, your little soul was from God. Scrooge turned to the ghost of Christmas future. It stood there in front of him. Ghost, said Scrooge, something tells me that our time together is almost over. I must know something. Who was that dead man? The ghost raised its white hand, and all of a sudden they were standing in front of Scrooge's office. Scrooge looked into the window, hoping to see himself. Where was he? Instead, there was another man working in his office and sitting at his desk. Ghost, he said, let me see my future self. In our time together, I have not seen the man I will become. The future Ebenezer Scrooge. Please, will you show him to me? The ghost did not answer. Its white hand was pointed in another direction. Scrooge had no choice but to follow the silent ghost. What was the meaning of all the things the ghost had shown him? Scrooge still didn't understand. They reached an iron gate. Scrooge saw that it was a graveyard. It was very ugly. The grass was dead and brown, and all the flowers on the graves were brown. The ghost walked to one of the gravestones and pointed to it. There were no flowers on this grave. Scrooge walked towards it. He was shaking badly. The ghost looked exactly the same as always, but Scrooge imagined that there was a new meaning in its shape. What was the ghost trying to tell him? "Oh, ghost of the future," Scrooge said in a weak voice, "please tell me one thing. Are the events you have shown me things that will happen, or things that might happen?" The black ghost said nothing. Its white hand continued to point at the grave. Scrooge took a deep breath and looked at the gravestone. On the gravestone he read his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge. "Oh, ghost!" Scrooge cried. He fell to his knees. "Do you mean that I am that dead man with no friends or family? That man who died alone, loving no one, and being loved by no one?" Horribly, the ghost's white finger pointed to Scrooge and then to the grave again. "Oh, no, spirit! Oh, no, no!" The terrible hand was still pointing at the grave. Scrooge grabbed the ghost's black robe. "Ghost," he cried, "listen to me. I am not the mean, terrible man that I was. I will not be the man that lay upon the bed, the dead man you showed me. Oh, ghost, why do you show me these things if I have no hope?" For the first time, Scrooge saw the white hand shake. "Good spirit," said Scrooge, kneeling on the ground before the ghost, "I understand that you pity me and want to help me. Please tell me that I can change this terrible future if I change myself." The ghost's kind hand trembled. "I will love and honor Christmas forever and never forget the lessons that the 3 ghosts of Christmas have taught me. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. Oh, tell me I can erase the writing on this stone." Tears were running down Scrooge's face. In his pain, Scrooge grabbed the ghost's hand. The ghost tried to pull its hand away, but Scrooge held on. The ghost, even stronger, pulled away. "I will remember," cried Scrooge. He saw the ghost's shape change. It seemed to become thinner and smaller. Then it turned into a bedpost. Chapter 5. The End. Yes, and the bedpost was his own. He was lying in his own bed again, in his own room. But the best thing was, it was early on a beautiful morning in the present time. Bells were ringing. "I will live in the past, the present, and the future. I will not forget," cried Scrooge as he jumped out of bed. "The spirits of all 3 ghosts will live inside my heart. I promise you, old Jacob Marley, on my knees." Scrooge was so amazed to find himself back in the present time again that he could barely speak. He realized that his face was wet with tears. He had been crying terribly in his time with the ghost of Christmas future. Scrooge looked at his bed. The bed curtains were still there. "They aren't torn down," he cried, running over to touch them. "They are here. I am alive. The awful future that I saw, I can change it. I will change my life." Scrooge almost jumped into his clothes. "I don't know what to do first," he cried. He was almost laughing and crying at the same time. "I am as happy as an angel and as cheerful as a schoolboy. Hurrah! Hello! Hurrah!" Scrooge ran into his sitting room. "There's the bowl of medicine I was drinking. There's the door that old Jacob Marley came into. It all really happened. Ha, ha, ha!" Dear reader, if you had heard old Scrooge laugh, you would be surprised. For an old man who had never laughed before, This was a wonderful beginning. Scrooge could hardly wait for the day to begin. "I don't even know what day it is or what year it is. I don't know anything. I'm like a baby," he said, laughing. "Never mind, I don't care. I'd rather be a baby." Scrooge ran to the window. The sky was clear and fresh, and the sun was rising. "Hello there," he called to a boy who was walking in the street. "Good morning. What day is it?" "What day is it? Why, it's Christmas morning, sir," said the boy. He looked surprised that this man didn't know. "How wonderful! It's Christmas Day," Scrooge cried. "I haven't missed Christmas. The ghosts did it all in one night. Amazing! They can do anything. Hello, my good boy. Do you know the meat shop on the next street?" "Yes, sir," said the boy. "An intelligent boy, a wonderful boy," cried Scrooge. "Now, would you please go and buy the largest turkey they have, and tell them to bring it here to me? I'll give you some money, and if you're back in less than 5 minutes, I'll give you more." The boy ran off immediately. "I know what I'll do," Scrooge cried, running around the room excitedly. "I'll send the bird to Bob Cratchit. He won't even know who sent it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim," he said, laughing loudly. In a few minutes the boy had come back with the turkey, and what a turkey it was! It was so big and fat that I am sure when it was alive it wasn't able to stand up. "My dear boy, we must find a carriage," cried Scrooge. Quickly, Scrooge wrote Bob Cratchit's address on a piece of paper and put the boy and the turkey in the carriage, laughing all the time. The little children would be so happy. The next thing Scrooge did was getting dressed. He wore his best clothes. He was in a hurry. He could not wait to get outside and see the beautiful morning. He went outside and walked along the streets. It was Christmas. He was so happy to be alive, for the first time in many years. Suddenly he saw the gentleman who had walked into his office yesterday, the one who had wanted him to give money to help the poor. Yesterday seemed like years ago to Scrooge. Scrooge was afraid of how the man would look at him when they met, but he knew what he had to do. "My dear sir," said Scrooge, walking up to the man and taking both his hands. "How are you? I hope you were successful in your work yesterday. A Merry Christmas to you." The man looked amazed, of course. "Mr. Scrooge?" he said. "Yes, that is my name. I am afraid it is not a pleasant name to you. I must apologize. Sir, I would like to give you some money for your work," said Scrooge. He whispered in the man's ear. The man nearly jumped into the air. "But, my dear Mr. Scrooge," he cried, "are you serious? That is very generous. But are you sure?" "Yes, I'm sure," said Scrooge cheerfully. "I have owed that money to the poor for many years now. So will you come to my office in a few days?" "Of course," said the gentleman. He was surprised and happy. Scrooge went to church and patted children on the head and held babies and gave coins to beggars. Everything he did gave him great happiness. In the afternoon he walked towards his nephew Fred's house. He walked past the house many times before he had the courage to knock on the door. What if Fred did not want to see him? The door opened and a maid looked out.
"Yes, sir,"
she said. "Is your master at home, my dear?" said Scrooge.
"Yes, sir. He's in the dining room. I'll bring you to him if you like."
"Thank you, my dear. He knows me. I know the way," said Scrooge. He walked up the stairs and into the dining room where Fred and his wife sat. Their friends and family had not arrived yet. They were laughing and talking and did not notice Scrooge at first. "Hello, Fred," said Scrooge. Fred and his wife turned around. "Why, Uncle Scrooge!" Fred said. He was amazed to see his uncle. "Yes, it's me, Fred. I would like to come to dinner. Would you let me?" "Let him?" Fred jumped up and said, "Of course, dear uncle." In just 5 minutes, Scrooge was sitting around the fire with Fred and his wife, very comfortable. It was wonderful when Mr. Topper came, and Fred's wife's sisters, and everyone else. What a lovely time they had! Wonderful party, wonderful games, everything. But Scrooge was at his office early the next morning. He couldn't wait to speak to Bob Cratchit. He had a surprise for him. When Bob came in, he was humming a little song. He looked happier than Scrooge had ever seen him. Quickly, Scrooge made himself look very angry, just like his old self. "Bob Cratchit," Scrooge shouted, "you are 10 minutes late to work." "Yes, I know, sir. It won't happen again. I was having a very good time last night, and—" "Well, I won't allow this sort of thing any more," said Scrooge. He looked like an angry bear, but inside he was laughing. "So, I will tell you what I am going to do, Mr. Cratchit. I'm going to raise your salary." "Sir, don't fire me. What?" "That's right. I am going to raise your salary. A Merry Christmas to you, dear Bob," cried Scrooge, patting his clerk on the back. "I will raise your salary and help your poor family also. I have never been a good friend or employer to you, but I will begin now. We'll discuss your situation this afternoon over a good hot cup of tea. Now, build up the fire, Bob, and make sure you are nice and warm." Well, dear reader, Ebenezer Scrooge did all those things for Bob Cratchit and much, much more. He was like a second father to Tiny Tim, who did not die, and he was a friend to all the people in that good old city of London for the rest of his life. Some people laughed at him because they thought that old Scrooge had gone crazy. But Scrooge did not care. He laughed at himself. Scrooge never saw the 3 ghosts of Christmas again, but he never forgot the lessons they taught him. For the rest of his life, everyone said that Ebenezer Scrooge knew how to celebrate Christmas better than any man in town. And I hope that you will celebrate Christmas too, dear reader. And so, as Tiny Tim said, what a wise little boy. God bless us, everyone.